peace. But just as these words send the wrong message, so too do the words we are not hearing from this council. Why can some council members still not bring themselves to condemn Hamas's horrific terrorist attack on October 7th? Why have some council members stopped talking about the plight of the more than 100 hostages being held by Hamas, or the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah continue to fire rockets on Israel? Roughly 250,000 Israelis are internally displaced because of these relentless attacks. And why have some council members refused to hold Hamas accountable for using civilians as human shields? We urge all member states to speak out and press Hamas and Hezbollah to do what is necessary to end the violence and displacement they have wrought. Colleagues, even as this council focuses on the conflict in Gaza, we must not turn our attention away from the West Bank, where there has been an unprecedented rise in violence in recent months. We've seen Palestinian extremist militants carry out attacks against Israeli civilians. We unequivocally condemn these attacks, just as we unequivocally condemn attacks by Israeli extremist settlers that target Palestinians and their property and displace entire communities. The United States strongly opposes the advancement of settlements in the West Bank, and we strongly oppose the violence that has come to characterize them. At their core, settlements undermine the geographic viability of a two-state solution, exacerbate tensions, and further harm trust between Israelis and Palestinians. At least 340 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed by Israelis in the past 3 months. And I want to be clear, the United States will continue to respond to this escalating violence, including through our new visa restriction policy. Under this policy, we have taken steps to improve visa restrictions against individuals who are involved in or meaningfully contributing to the undermining of peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. But we know that this is just one piece of the broader picture, and we urge the Israeli government to prevent and investigate settler violence and hold extremists who perpetuate it to account. We also urge the Israeli government to exercise restraint in its operations in the West Bank by respecting civilian infrastructure, especially in refugee camps, and minimizing civilian harm. Finally, we have long maintained that stability in the West Bank is dependent on PA security forces. That means the PA must make steps toward reform and revitalization, and it means Israel must release revenues that allow the PA to pay their security forces. Colleagues, at this profoundly difficult moment, the United States has stepped up to lead and to advance a vision for lasting peace, where Israel is integrated into the region and terrorist groups can no longer threaten Israel's security, where Palestinians realize their aspirations for a state of their own, and Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank are unified under the Palestinian Authority, where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace with equal measures of security, freedom, and dignity. This is the only way forward. This is the only way to end this terrible cycle of violence once and for all. The damning reality is that Israelis and Palestinians will forever be scarred by years and years of mistrust and fear and violence. But the generations that follow need not know this reality. So let us work together to sow the seeds of peace. That must be our charge. Thank you, Mr. President.
I wish to thank the representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
President, we thank the Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and the ASG Ilse Carrots for their assessment of the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip. The Russian Federation supported Algeria's initiative to convene today's extraordinary council meeting on the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone, focusing on the threat of the forced transfer of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, guided by the unlawfulness of these steps taken by West Jerusalem under international law. This is only part of the bloody puzzle that makes up the picture of the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. As of now, the enclave has seen 23,000 deaths. Preliminary figures alone point to over 7,500 children and thousands of people are still buried under the ruins. Given the pace and the power of the strikes in populated areas, every day in Gaza there are deaths and maimings of dozens, if not hundreds, of Gazans. Civilian infrastructure, including medical sites, is practically destroyed. The total blockade of the Gaza has led to an acute lack of water, fuel, and medications. From the beginning of the conflict, around 2 million people have been compelled to leave their homes. Half of them are women and children. Most of the internally displaced persons, or to be more precise, forcibly transferred persons, have found refuge in UNRWA institutions, which, despite their status, have continued to be subject to Israeli bombing. These people have been stripped of their homes, property, livelihoods, and many are teetering on the brink of inevitable starvation. The ghastly humanitarian situation in Gaza demonstrates how catastrophic it could be to continue along the path of ignoring international law. The 7th of October attacks, of course, are reprehensible. At the same time, these events cannot legitimize Israel's indiscriminate use of force in the Gaza Strip, especially because this form of carrying out hostilities, which is in fact becoming a collective punishment of the Palestinians, is linked with many gross violations of international law. Moreover, the October 7th events should not be viewed in isolation from the long, bloody history of Palestinian-Israeli confrontation, which has dragged on for several decades and is linked with oppression, occupation, and many crimes against the Palestinian people. Against this backdrop, the UN Security Council, as the chief body for the maintenance of international peace and security, has still failed to shoulder its direct mandate and adopt a resolution containing an unequivocal call to the parties to immediately implement a ceasefire. We regret to note that Security Council Resolution 2712 did not contain this key call that was due to U.S. opposition. So the practical significance of that resolution verges on nothing. Resolution 2720, from which we abstained upon the request of the Arab states, under U.S. pressure, is saturated with highly dubious calls to create the condition for the cessation of hostilities. I want to stress once more that we flatly oppose the content of the current OP2 of Resolution 27.2, and I want to say that the responsibility for the possible impact of that resolution lies with the states that gave their consent to its drafting which was ramped through by the U.S. Mr. President, together with the constant indiscriminate bombings and targeted strikes on civilian objects intended to sow fear and panic among civilians, we see the holistic strategy of West Jerusalem to forcibly displace the Palestinians. The logic here is simple: making life unbearable in Gaza even impossible, leaving civilians with an impossible choice: leave their native lands or kill. The ongoing violent expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza will inevitably shake the entire Middle East and North African region with dire consequences for the whole world. The UN Secretariat, headed by the Secretary General and the majority of overwhelming majority of the UN member states have sounded the alarm, condemning these steps by the Israeli leadership, and they are united in their striving to take decisive action to prevent this mass violent deportation of Palestinians from their lands. The Israeli side is obligated to abide by the norms of international humanitarian law, specifically Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention of 1949, which directly bans the deportation and violent transfer of persons enjoying protection. Pursuant to Articles 23 and 59 of this 4th Geneva Convention, occupying powers have a special obligation to ensure that civilians have basic goods. Against that backdrop, given a major concern is elicited by Israel's plans to flood the Gaza tunnels. According to basic estimates, we're talking about 1,300 corridors. They are 500 kilometers in length. They're going to be flooding them with 1.5 million cubic meters of water. I want to stress in particular that the impact of the contamination of this groundwater, which is Gaza's only fresh water source, that these implications will continue for 100 years. Taking this step threatens a major environmental disaster, but it will also make the territory of the enclave unsuitable for life. These steps could be qualified as one element of genocide in accordance with Article 2C of the 1948 Convention on the prevention of the crime of genocide and on its punishment. Pursuant to, complaints have been lodged against Israel in the International Court of the UN by South Africa, Bangladesh, Bolivia, the Comoros, and Djibouti. And this is in addition to what's happening, will be happening in the later half of February in The Hague. The hearings on the legal consequences of Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. Given this, can we count on an appropriate assessment of what is happening from paid-for bodies such as the ICC? No, we cannot. We have no illusions that the British prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, will screw up his courage to oppose his Western backers and their allies, because this body is intended to serve their political interests. There's similar inaction by the ICC that we've seen in connection with the war crimes of the U.S., Great Britain, and their satellites in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. After the investigation was not started, it was simply deprioritized. As for Israel, the head of ICC is acting in the same way. He's limiting himself to incoherent justifications and mentioning some previous calls for stopping the violence. Against this grim backdrop, what is striking are media reports of the idea of Israeli leadership that they're going to convince Arab, African, and European countries to take in Palestinian refugees, and they want Arab monarchies to bankroll this transfer. The very fact of these leaks, coupled with the ongoing provocative statements by the Israeli establishment, this provokes additional tensions and undermines the universally acknowledged international legal basis for an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the consistent erosion of which by Washington has led to the current explosion. Now, Russia's approach is unchanged. We want an immediate ceasefire. We want untrammeled, safe humanitarian access, release of hostages, and reestablishment of a political horizon for the Middle East peace process based on the two-state solution. President, the escalation in Gaza has continued for over 100 days with no sign of abating. Moreover, the U.S. and its allies have single-handedly triggered a spillover of the conflict to the entire region, having attacked yesterday in violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter the people of Yemen. The Council will be discussing this egregious situation a bit later in a separate briefing. Apparently, this effective bilateral diplomacy in the region, or to put it more simply, this arbitrary act, apparently this is what our American colleagues are referring to when they're saying that they are acting better than multilateral efforts. This all leads to one chief conclusion. Without an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the Middle East risks plunging into an abyss of a full-fledged war with the direst of global repercussions. The UN Security Council has the obligation to, again, consider this matter forthwith. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. Thank you, Mr. President.
En primer lugar,
At
agradezco
the
al
outset,
secretario
I
general
wish to
adjunto de
thank
Asuntos Humanitarios y
the Undersecretary General for
coordinador de
Humanitarian
socorro de
Affairs
emergencias,
and
Martin
Emergency
Griffiths,
Relief
y
Coordinator
a la
Martin
subsecretaria
Griffiths, and
general
I also
para
wish
Derechos
to thank
Humanos,
the
Ilse
Assistant
Brandse
Secretary General for
Keres,
Human Rights, Ms.
por los
Ilse
sombríos
Brandse-Keres. I
informes que
thank both
acabamos
for
de
the
escuchar,
somber reports
al
that we've
tiempo que
just
reitero el
heard.
apoyo de
At the
Ecuador
same
para
time, I
sus
reiterate
labores.
Ecuador's support for their
Hace
work.
más de un año,
More
en
than
el
a
primer
year
discurso
ago, in the
pronunciado
first
como
statement
miembros no
we made
permanentes
as
del Consejo
non-permanent
sobre este
members of
tema,
the Security Council
mi
on this
delegación
issue,
hizo
my
un llamado a
delegation
cesar las
called
declaraciones
for
incendiarias que
incendiary
profundizan el
statements to
conflicto
stop such
e incitan a la
statements,
violencia.
exacerbate
Hoy
conflict and
hemos sido
incite
convocados
violence.
debido a la
Today,
preocupación
this meeting has
generada
been
por
convened in
precisamente
view
este
of the
tipo de
concern
declaraciones
prompted over
en
exactly such
circunstancias
statements that are
mucho más
today being made
difíciles.
in much more difficult
Señor Presidente,
circumstances. Mr. President,
este
this
Consejo ha sido
Council
claro en
has been
rechazar el
clear
desplazamiento
in
forzoso de la
rejecting the
población
forced
civil,
displacement of the civilian
incluidos los
population,
niños,
including of
en
children,
contravención del
in
derecho
violation of
internacional,
international law,
incluido el derecho
including
internacional
of international
humanitario y el derecho
humanitarian law
internacional
and
de los derechos
international human
humanos.
rights law.
Lo ha hecho
The
dos
Council
veces en
has
los
done
últimos
so
60
twice
días
in the
en las
last 60
resoluciones
days in
2712
resolutions
y
2712
2720.
and 2720.
En la misma resolución 2720,
In
el Consejo
Resolution
destacó que la Franja de
2720,
Gaza
the
constituye
Council
una parte
underscored the fact
integral
that the
del
Gaza Strip
territorio
constitutes
ocupado
an
en
integral part of the territory occupied in
1967 y reiteró
1967.
la
It
aspiración
reiterated
a la
the desire
solución
to see a
biestatal
two-state
según la cual la
solution
Franja de
under
Gaza
which the
forma
Gaza
parte del
Strip
gobierno
forms
palestino.
part of the Palestinian
El Ecuador
government,
reitera
says
su
the
total
Speaker.
coincidencia con lo
Ecuador
señalado por
reiterates
el
the fact that
Consejo,
it agrees
así como
absolutely with what
insiste
the
en la
Council has
necesidad
said.
de
We
alcanzar
also
una
insist
solución
upon the need
pacífica,
to achieve a
negociada,
peaceful,
definitiva y
negotiated,
justa para las
definitive and
partes, con la existencia
solution,
de
and
dos
one which is
estados,
just to
Palestina
both
e
parties, with the
Israel,
existence of
sobre
two
la base de
states,
las fronteras de
Palestine and Israel, on the basis of
1967 y de las
1967 borders
resoluciones
and on the
relevantes.
basis of relevant
Señor
resolutions.
Presidente,
Mr.
colegas,
President, colleagues,
en los últimos días
in the
hemos
last
recibido un informe del
days, we
secretario
have
general
received a report from
sobre la
the Secretary
implementación
General
de la
on the
resolución
implementation of
2712,
Resolution
en el que
2712.
claramente
That
se dice que
report
sus
clearly
disposiciones
states
están
that
lejos
the
de ser
provisions of that
cumplidas
resolution
y en
are
el que el
far from being
progreso realizado
upheld.
es
The report
totalmente
also makes it clear that
insuficiente.
the progress made falls
Los
woefully short
acontecimientos
of
en el
that
terreno
required.
dan cuenta de una
Events on the
violencia
ground
incesante,
tell of
de más
incessant
muertos y
violence,
heridos,
of more
de
people
una
being killed
situación
and wounded,
humanitaria
and of a
insostenible
humanitarian
que
situation which is
empeora
unsustainable
constantemente.
and which is
Los
worsening
rehenes de
day by
Hamas
day.
siguen cautivos,
Hamas hostages
la población
continue to be
civil
held
sigue
hostage.
desplazada y
The
el peligro
civilian
de una expansión de la
population
violencia en la
remains
región
displaced, and there is
aumenta.
an increasing
En
risk
definitiva,
of the violence
estamos
spreading
observando
to the
cómo,
wider region. Ultimately, we're
lamentablemente,
seeing how,
las
regrettably, the
disposiciones de este
provisions
Consejo
of
tienen
this
un
Council
limitado
have a
impacto en la
limited
realidad.
impact on
En
reality.
este caso,
In light of
creemos
that fact, we
evidente que
believe
sin
that
un
it is
cese al
patently
fuego
clear that
humanitario
without a
es
humanitarian
imposible
ceasefire, it is
implementar lo
impossible
decidido.
to implement the provisions that have
Pero
been
no podemos
adopted. However,
desalentarnos.
we cannot
Es
lose
nuestro
heart.
deber
It is
seguir
our
trabajando y
duty to
hacer todo lo
continue
posible para
working
que la
and to do
situación
everything we can
mejore.
to ensure that the situation
En este
improves.
sentido,
As such,
valoramos la
we
apertura del
welcome
paso
the
de Kerem
opening
Shalom
of the Kerem Shalom
por
crossing
parte de
by
Israel,
Israel.
que ha permitido
That
el
has
ingreso de ayuda
allowed
humanitaria a la franja por un
humanitarian
segundo
aid
punto.
to enter the Gaza Strip through a second
En cuanto a la
location.
resolución
Turning to
2720,
Resolution 2720,
valoramos la
we
celeridad con la que
value
el
the
secretario general
expeditious
designó a
nature
Sigrid Kaag como
of
coordinadora
the Secretary
superior
General's
de
appointment
asuntos
of Sigrid
humanitarios
Kaag as
y de la
Senior
reconstrucción de
Humanitarian and
Gaza.
Reconstruction Coordinator.
Deseamos que su labor sea
We
exitosa
wish her every
y
success
pronto
in
se
her
pueda
work, and
implementar
we
el
hope to
mecanismo de
see
Naciones
the
Unidas para
timely
acelerar la
implementation
entrega de
of
los
the UN
envíos de
mechanism
socorro
for speeding up the
humanitarios a
provision of
Gaza.
humanitarian relief
Asimismo,
consignments to Gaza.
la resolución
Moreover,
2720 llama
Resolution
a crear las
2720
condiciones
calls for
para
the
un cese
creation of
de hostilidades
conditions for a
sostenible.
cessation of hostilities which is
Llamamos a
sustainable in
avanzar en
nature.
este
We
sentido.
call for progress to
Para
be made
concluir,
along that
señor
path.
presidente
To
y
conclude, Mr.
colegas,
President and colleagues,
reitero la
I
condena del
reiterate the
Ecuador a
fact
los
that
atroces
Ecuador
actos
condemns
terroristas de
the
Hamas
atrocious
iniciados el 7 de
terrorist
octubre,
acts perpetrated
a
by
la
Hamas,
violencia
which began
sexual
on the 7th of
y a
October.
todo
We
tipo de
condemn
actos de
sexual
violencia
violence
contra
and all
civiles.
acts of violence
E
perpetrated against
insisto
civilians.
en
I
nuestra demanda de que
reiterate
se
our
libere
call for
inmediata
the
e
immediate and
incondicionalmente a
unconditional
todos los
release of
rehenes y
all
entre tanto
hostages.
se garantice
Meanwhile,
el
we
acceso
must
humanitario
guarantee
para atender sus
humanitarian access
necesidades
to
médicas
meet their
tal
medical
como lo
needs
exigen las
as
resoluciones
demanded by
2712 y
Resolutions 2712
2720.
and
Muchas gracias.
2720. Thank you.
Je remercie
I thank
le représentant de
the
l'Équateur
representative
de
of
cette déclaration.
Garador for that
Et je donne à
statement. I
présent la
now give
parole
the
à la
floor to
représentante
the
du
representative
Royaume-Uni.
of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Under-Secretary-General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary Brands-Keris for their briefings today. President, I have 3 points to make today. Firstly, the UK firmly rejects any proposal that Palestinians should be resettled outside Gaza, including proposals from members of the Israeli government. Our views and concerns are shared by our allies and partners, that Gazans should not be subject to forcible displacement or relocation from Gaza. Second, the UK is alarmed by record levels of extremist settler violence in the occupied Palestinian territories and its devastating impact. According to OCHA, since the 7th of October, at least 198 Palestinian households, including 586 children, have been displaced following an increase in extremist settler violence and access restrictions. We call on the government of Israel not only to condemn settler violence, but also to take direct action against those responsible for it and hold them accountable and ensure that Palestinian civilians are protected. We also continue to call on Israel to cease immediately all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and its lower aqueduct, and to respect their in their absolute entirety all legal obligations. We reiterate our long-standing position that settlements are illegal under international law and that settlement expansions hinder us from creating the conditions for a durable peace in Israel, the West Bank, and across all the occupied Palestinian territories. Third, the UK is intensely focused on ensuring more aid gets into Gaza. The current levels are woefully inadequate for the deepening humanitarian crisis. We're deeply concerned that the World Food Programme is reporting that 9 out of 10 families are going with less than 1 meal a day. We want to see a ceasefire, but this must be a sustainable ceasefire, one that will last. A sustainable ceasefire means one in which Hamas no longer poses a threat to Israel's security. Aid is delivered without hindrance, and Palestinians can return to the areas of Gaza from which they have been displaced. Ahead of a permanent ceasefire, we want to see immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses. This will allow for hostages to be released and more aid to enter Gaza. In accordance with Security Council Resolution 2720, we call on Israel to allow for higher volumes of humanitarian aid through as many routes as possible. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call again for the release of hostages taken on the 7th of October, for measures to allow humanitarian aid in to meet the desperate humanitarian need in Gaza, for a sustainable ceasefire with a political horizon towards a two-state solution. And we remain committed to working with Israelis, Palestinians, and all parties in the region and beyond to make this a reality. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni
thank the
de
representative
cette
of the United
déclaration
Kingdom for that
et je donne
statement.
à présent
And I
la
now give the
parole
floor to
au
the
représentant de la
representative
Chine.
of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank Algeria for the initiative to hold this meeting, and USG briefers and ASG carriers for their briefings. Nearly 100 days into the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, more than 23,000 people in Gaza and over 200 UN personnel and journalists have lost their lives. 90% of the population of Gaza has been displaced. More than 60% of homes have been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are struggling to survive in makeshift tents. All of these are not just the code numbers, but the loss of human lives. and the suffering that is experienced on a daily basis. Today, in the 21st century, the records that keep getting broken are none other than those of war and their death tolls. This is a stain on human conscience that can never be scrubbed off. An immediate ceasefire has become the overwhelming call of the international community, but a permanent member of the Security Council has been using various excuses to veto consensus on this issue in the Security Council. This is a blatant contempt of international fairness and justice and the authority of the Security Council. Some people have constantly talked about the protection of human rights and the prevention of genocide, while in the face of the appalling situation in Gaza, they have played dumb, kept stonewalling, and attempted to deflect attention. This is downright double standards. It is imperative that we remove all interference and take robust action to end the fighting, save lives, and restore peace. First, any forced displacement of the Palestinian people must be firmly rejected. Gaza is the homeland of the Palestinian people. Over the past 3 months, over 1 million people have been forced to relocate again and again, but in the face of the constant threats of death, they have nowhere to hide and nowhere to flee. Some Israeli political figures have called for voluntary emigration from Gaza, over which we express our grave concern. That would mean driving 2 million population out of Gaza and turning Gaza into a so-called safe zone devoid of human habitation. If put into practice, such a horrific idea would constitute atrocity crimes under international law and would completely destroy the prospect of the two-state solution. We have taken note of some statements and clarifications made by Israel in this regard. But on this issue, while what is said is important, what is done is even more important. We are paying close attention to Israel's declared intentions, while at the same time paying more attention to its serious consequences in reality. Secondly, all measures must be taken to alleviate the humanitarian disaster. At present, access to humanitarian supplies is extremely limited. Food, medicine, and other essential supplies are extremely scarce. Disease and hunger are spreading in Gaza, and social order is on the verge of collapse. Secretary General Guterres has repeatedly emphasized that conditions for delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza do not exist under gunfire. It is Israel that has continued its indiscriminate bombardment against Gaza and has placed numerous obstacles blocking access to humanitarian supplies. But it is also Israel that has accused the United Nations of not having the will and ability to provide humanitarian assistance. This is totally unacceptable. Security Council resolutions 2712 and 2720 must be fully implemented. Israel must fulfill its obligations as the occupying power, ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, and provide full cooperation in humanitarian relief efforts. China welcomes the concrete proposals by Secretary General Guterres on the implementation of Resolution 2712 and the appointment of Ms. Tag as UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. China supports further action by the Security Council to clear obstacles to the safe, rapid, and unimpeded entry of sufficient humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Thirdly, a ceasefire must be promoted with the utmost urgency. Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties and humanitarian disasters and create conditions for the early release of all hostages. Only a ceasefire can prevent the foundation of the two-state solution from being completely destroyed, and only a ceasefire can prevent the entire Middle East region from being devoured by a calamity. However, it is worrying that instead of seeing the prospect of an immediate ceasefire, the situation is heading towards the expansion of the conflict. We urge the international community, especially countries with major influence, to make the realization of a ceasefire the overriding urgent task. We call Israel to reverse course immediately and stop its indiscriminate military attacks on and the destruction of Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel should effectively curb settler violence and stop the searches, arrests, and raids against the Palestinians. Israel should seize the tax revenue to the Palestinian National Authority as soon as possible. We are concerned about the spillover effects of the Gaza conflict on the situation in the Red Sea. The military action launched by US and UK against Yemen will undoubtedly exacerbate regional tensions. We call on all parties to effectively abide by the UN Charter and international law and to make joint efforts to maintain peace and security in the Red Sea and the Middle East. Thank you, President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Harris for their most pertinent briefings. At the outset, we must stress that the catastrophic situation in Gaza is causing immense levels of death, suffering and displacement amongst the civilian population. Millions of civilians are enduring the deprivation of basic necessities, leading to a staggering loss of life. This plight is no more tragic than when one considers the humanitarian consequences this has on women and children, who suffer disproportionately from food insecurity, malnutrition, and the crippling healthcare system. We reiterate that there is an urgent need to genuinely facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid into and within Gaza, including through the opening of additional crossing points. Furthermore, all arbitrary bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian operations must cease. Equally fundamental is the need to assure and safeguard the safety of UN and humanitarian workers, including the security of their premises. The rising death toll amongst humanitarian, Palestinian Red Crescent Society and UNRWA staff is unacceptable. Within this context, Malta calls for the immediate and full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. We look forward to working with the newly appointed Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, towards ensuring this. President, we must also not forget the plight of those hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. In accordance with Resolution 2712, Malta calls for the immediate and safe release of the remaining hostages. We unreservedly condemn the Hamas terror attacks of 7th October, including the recurring rocket fire into Israeli territory, and further denounce any acts of sexual violence committed. Malta emphasizes the utmost importance of adhering to international humanitarian law and accountability for those who violate it. It is imperative that all parties take the necessary measures to safeguard civilians and protect civilian infrastructure. Likewise, attacks on religious sites and individuals seeking refuge within them are unacceptable, as are any deliberate targeting of journalists in the conflict. President, we remain convinced of the need for an urgent cessation of hostilities. The establishment of a humanitarian ceasefire is the only way through which a meaningful and effective humanitarian response throughout the entirety of Gaza can be mounted. This cessation of hostilities is also critical within the context of the displacement of the Palestinian people. Palestinians in Gaza must be allowed to return to their homes or provided with adequate and safe shelter until their homes are rebuilt. the forced displacement of populations and the transfer of populations from occupied territory is a grave violation of international law and a war crime under the Fourth Geneva Convention. We reject any attempts regarding the forced or coercive transfer of Palestinian people out of Gaza. Statements to this effect from figures within the Israeli government are deeply regrettable. We are also deeply concerned that in the past weeks we have witnessed a resurgence of forced transfer of Palestinian communities linked to demolitions, illegal settler encroachment and violence in the West Bank. Malta strongly stresses that settlements violate international law, obstruct peace, and threaten the viability of an independent, contiguous Palestinian state. Israeli settler violence is unacceptable and must be addressed without impunity. Such action also inflames tensions and risk a further spillover of the conflict. All parties must mitigate any threats which inflame regional tensions, including escalations on the Blue Line and in the Red Sea. The universal norms of international law must be respected on all fronts. A fundamental recommitment to political dialogue, which is based on the realization of a two-state solution, has never been more essential. Malta reiterates its conviction that the only viable path to achieving peace lies within the internationally agreed parameters of the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Japon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Griffith and the ASG Brands-Case for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, 3 months have passed since the heinous acts of terror were committed by Hamas and other militant groups. Since then, Gaza has been under heavy bombardments and relentless shelling, making Gaza as one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes witnessed today. The extent of the suffering in Gaza is unimaginable. At least 23,000 Palestinians have been reportedly killed in Gaza, including a heartbreaking loss of over 10,000 children. Over 85% of the population across the Gaza Strip have been displaced. Critical civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and UN shelters, have not been spared from attacks. Famine is imminent, and those internally displaced are at high risk of communicable diseases due to extremely poor living conditions. Humanity is in crisis. The international community must continue to work with a greater sense of urgency towards alleviating the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We fully support the recent appointed UN Senior Coordinator, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and her staff to this end. While the Security Council adopted Resolution 2712 and 2720, regrettably, their effective implementation remains elusive due to the ongoing heavy fighting. As violent regional spillover is already happening, what is most urgent is the de-escalation of the conflict. In this regard, our position is clear as shown in our voting positions in relevant resolutions, including the UNGA resolution adopted on December 12 last year. We would also like to emphasize once again the hostages held by Hamas and other militant groups must be released immediately and unconditionally to create better conditions towards easing tensions. Mr. President, Japan is concerned about the recent inflammatory rhetoric by Israeli ministers on the, quote, resettlement, unquote, of Palestinians outside of the Gaza Strip. Any attempt to forcibly displace the Palestinian people is inconsistent with the relevant Security Council resolutions and in violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. we reject any such forced displacement. We also stress the need to create conditions to enable displaced Palestinians in Gaza to return safely to their homes. In this regard, we note recent reports that Israel has agreed to allow the UN to carry out an assessment mission in northern Gaza. We should create a conducive environment where the residents can return safely to their homes. In conclusion, Japan will continue to exert its utmost efforts to contribute to the de-escalation of this conflict within and beyond Gaza. A two-state solution remains the only viable path for both Israel and the future independent Palestinian state, which must include the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to live side by side in mutual peace and security. I thank you, President.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon
thank the
pour cette
representative of
déclaration.
Japan for that
Et
statement.
je donne à présent la parole
And
au
I'll give the floor
représentant
to
de
the
la Slovénie.
representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also would like to thank Undersecretary General Griffith and Assistant Secretary Brans-Keris for their very sober and yet very clear briefings. Looking at the situation in Gaza and the broader Middle East region, we believe it is high time to reflect on our responsibility as the Council. Slovenia shares the concerns of briefers regarding the several recent statements by members of the Israeli government proposing mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, and we strongly reject them. Any displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza would constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law, amounting to a war crime. We condemn such statements, which are only escalating tensions. Secondly, we are appalled by the current conditions in which internally displaced people of Gaza are living. 85% of Gaza's population is displaced. Military operations, including indiscriminate bombardment, are forcing people to flee over and over again. As the recent report of the Secretary General has outlined, Gaza is facing widespread death and destruction. Famine looms rampant. There is an evolving public health catastrophe, with children, pregnant women, and older among those most at risk. There is a dire need to scale up humanitarian aid and allow rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian assistance. In this regard, we welcome the appointment of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza and stand ready to support her. Throughout the conflict, we have repeatedly called for full respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law. I would like to voice our concern over the grave violations we are witnessing in Gaza. All the reports we are receiving on the humanitarian situation demonstrate that Gaza is uninhabitable. People have been seeking shelter at hospitals and UNRWA facilities, which are overcrowded and without adequate sanitation facilities, and even those have been bombed. Civilians have been sheltering in the so-called safe zones, which have been bombed as well. Mr. President, the bottom line is that no place in Gaza is safe. So where will these people return? We are talking about whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble, roads and infrastructure related to water, electricity, sewage. The most basic infrastructure has been damaged. Hospitals, religious sites, schools, museums, the ancient port of Gaza, and more destroyed. Of course, we are aware of Hamas using some civilian infrastructure to continue its attacks on Israel. Of course, we are aware of the brutality of the October 7 attack on Israeli civilians. We are deeply concerned by the information about sexual violence by Hamas, which needs to be investigated and addressed. And we are calling on Hamas to immediately release all hostages so they can return to their families. But that cannot and does not justify destroying disproportionately civilian infrastructure and life in Gaza. Condemning the statements on displacements is not enough. We need to prevent actions leading to displacements. Displacement does not necessarily be a forced one, but could happen because of Palestinians not having anywhere to return. This brings me to my last point, Mr. President. Before we can enable the UN to deliver enough humanitarian assistance to people of Gaza, before we can start creating conditions for a safe return, we need to demand an immediate ceasefire. A ceasefire that would stop destruction of Gaza, that would return the hostages, and that would help us calm the region. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting. Let me also thank USG, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and ASG, Ms. Ilza Brandt-Keris, for their important briefing. Mr. President, when Sierra Leone first addressed this agenda item, the situation in the Middle East, in the Security Council in May 1970, our representative stated that the plight of the Palestinian refugees is great. Development and progress are a matter of urgency for both Arabs and Jews. Surely, it is in the interest of mankind that we should all seek passionately and persistently a way towards peace and allow the process of conciliation and reconciliation. More than half a century later, we are convened in this chamber to address the threat of forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. In the context of the continuing occupation by Israel of the Palestinian territories, and the escalation following the 7th October 2023 heinous attacks by Hamas, Sierra Leone has and continues to condemn in the strongest terms the heinous attack against Israeli civilians by Hamas and the taking of hostages. Sierra Leone emphasizes a call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, noting that the taking of hostages is a serious breach of international law. We also strongly condemn attacks on civilians, Palestinian civilians, and civilian infrastructure. The practice of collective punishment and forced displacement of Palestinian people. As reported by the Secretary General, 1.9 million Palestinians are internally displaced and are mostly sheltering in or around the vicinity of UNRWA installations in Gaza. We reject any attempt to remove Palestinians from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, either temporarily or for a long time period. We deeply reject the unacceptable high human cost with the report of the killings of about 23,000 Palestinian civilians since the 7th October 2023, with women and children being the most affected. We regret the ultimate cost being paid by UN and other humanitarian workers and journalists. Sierra Leone calls for accountability for all those responsible for violations of international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and those crimes of serious concern to the international community. Mr. President, in the past 3 months, we've witnessed a situation that has become increasingly precarious, leading to the breakdown of systems, loss of lives, and destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. A situation that has deepened the complexity of the Middle East Palestinian question, with ramifications for regional escalation. We note with grave concern the severe humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip due to the continuous violence and denial of access to life-saving humanitarian aid at the scale and means necessary. We call on all parties to comply with this Council's resolutions 2712, 2720, and their obligations under international law to allow for rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access to the civilians in need. Sierra Leone therefore calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which in our view will bring an end to the atrocities, reduce regional tensions, and allow for the consolidation of ongoing humanitarian efforts by the United Nations and other international partners geared towards having an effective humanitarian aid operation in the Gaza Strip. In closing, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for political and diplomatic efforts to facilitate the two-state solution that will ensure Israel and Palestine live side by side in long-lasting peace and security. I thank you.
Je remercie le
I
représentant
thank
de la
the
Sierra Leone
representative
de sa
of Sierra
déclaration
Leone for that
et je donne à
statement.
présent la parole
I now
au
give the floor
représentant
to
de
the
la République de
representative of the
Corée.
Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also join in thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffith and Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Ilse Kerrith, for their briefing today. More than 3 months have now passed since the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, which we condemn in the strongest terms. Since then, hostilities have been ongoing in Gaza and Israel, and the consequences are extremely alarming. USG Martin Griffith last week characterized the situation on the ground, that Gaza has become a place of death and despair. Civilians in Gaza, including women and children, have no safe place, as even hospitals are being besieged by military operations and airstrikes. Today, USG Martin Griffith briefed to the members of the Secret Council that there has barely been any improvement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, despite adoption of Resolution 2712 and 2720. In his alarming letter to the Council last week, Secretary General Guterres also detailed that the level of aid to Palestinians in Gaza is completely inadequate for 2 million people as widespread famine looms. Mr. President, more sustainable humanitarian pauses that can lead to a sustainable cessation of hostilities are of utmost importance. Based on these, delivery of critical humanitarian aid must be expanded and expedited. Countless trucks with humanitarian aids from numerous countries are lining up, waiting for their turn to enter Gaza, which myself witnessed in my trip to Rafah crossing. Mr. President, the Palestinian people's right to live on their own land must be guaranteed. Individual or mass forcible transfer of Palestinians outside Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, is simply not acceptable. In this regard, we have deep concerns over Israeli high-level officials' comments suggesting mass displacements or the so-called voluntary migration of Palestinians out of Gaza. We are also extremely alarmed by these inflammatory remarks by various Israeli ministers that Israel must resettle the Gaza Strip. Security Council Resolution 2334, adopted in 2016, clearly condemns all measures aimed at altering the demographic composition, character, and status of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including the transfer of Israeli settlers and the displacement of Palestinian civilians. Any such act is in violation of international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions. All settlement activities must be ceased, and Gaza must not be resettled. Resolution 2334 also calls upon the parties to refrain from provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric. The rhetoric of high-level Israeli officials, including multiple ministers, on the possible forced displacement of Palestinians does not in any way help to ease the tension that is widespread all around the Middle East. Mr. President, we all know, and every member in this chamber keep reaffirming, that the only possible way to stop the cycle of violence is through the realization of the state solution, with both Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders consistent with international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Any acts or statements that hinder the realization of this aspiration of the world must stop immediately. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I express my appreciation to Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Assistant Secretary General Elise Brands-Keris for their sobering and informative briefing. Mr. President, Guyana is deeply concerned about the forced displacement of the population in Gaza since 7th of October. We take note that many Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced multiple times within the territory. We are now alarmed at the statements emanating from certain officials suggesting that the Palestinian people in Gaza should be forcibly transferred out of the territory to countries in the region and elsewhere. Guyana rejects these proposals and calls on this Council to do all within its power to protect the Palestinian population in Gaza from such a plight reminiscent of 1948. We must condemn in no uncertain terms these and all other suggestions which purport to violate international law, sending a strong message to the authors of these suggestions that they cannot carry out such actions unopposed. Mr. President, the displacement of the population in Gaza is distressing to Guyana on two fronts. First, the circumstances under which people have been uprooted from their homes and livelihoods have created a catastrophic humanitarian situation involving disease, destruction, danger, and death. Palestinian men, women, and children have been herded into smaller and smaller spaces in the Gaza Strip and forced to eke out an existence in the most inhumane conditions and without an adequate supply of food, water, medicine, fuel, and other basic items essential for survival. Social services, including the delivery of quality education and healthcare, have been severely disrupted. Women are unable to give birth, a most sacred experience in a safe environment. There is acute food insecurity, sparking legitimate concerns about mass starvation and death as famine looms. As if these conditions were not bad enough, these displaced persons live with the constant threat of bombs and bullets destroying or maiming them and their loved ones. Mr. President, the second element of concern to Guyana, particularly if there are mass forced transfers outside of Gaza, relates to the implications for the two-state solution. The prospects for a Palestinian state cannot be divorced from the necessity of the Palestinian people inhabiting the territory that pertains to them. Forcibly removing Palestinians from Gaza undermines these prospects, and coupled with an expanding settler policy in the West Bank, leaves no doubt about the likely fate of the two-state solution. In this context, Guyana underscores the importance of advancing the implementation of Security Council Resolutions 242, 338, 1397, and other relevant resolutions for realization of this two-state solution. Mr. President, we must tackle these issues frontally. Guyana was encouraged by the earlier public assurances from the Israeli government that it has no intention of displacing the civilian population of Gaza. But pronouncements by some Israeli officials give reason for real worry. Israel's actions must be in tandem with their earlier assurances. The first and most critical step at this stage, Mr. President, is a cessation of all hostilities, an immediate ceasefire. Outside of this, displacement will continue because people will have to keep moving in the hope of finding safety somewhere in the hell that is Gaza right now. Mr. President, Ghana wants to partner with this Council and the international community to end the indignity that the people of Gaza are enduring. We are prepared to work hard with everyone to end this war and to rebuild and reconstruct lives. Most importantly, we are prepared, as we have always been, to work with everyone to find a path to advance the two-state solution. Palestinians and Israelis alike deserve lasting peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for that statement and now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria for calling this briefing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with particular focus on the forced displacement of the Palestinian people. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Ilse Brands-Currys, Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, for their assessment on the situation in Gaza. Mr. President, after 3 months of war, the situation in Gaza is dire, with endless death, forced relocations, unparalleled health catastrophe, famine, and no prospect or hope for Gaza. Forced displacement and limits on humanitarian aid are not acceptable. Innocent civilians are those who suffer the most. It is our duty to uphold respect and dignity. In fact, the United Nations has reported that the Gaza Strip continues to suffer from intense bombardments that have caused immense casualties and destruction of vital civilian infrastructure, creating a total crisis. These actions violate the international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the Geneva Convention on Displaced Persons. The peak of regional escalation of the conflict in the Middle East has reached the highest level. It is therefore imperative that this conflict cease immediately before the consequences spread any further, or it will be too late to stop and limit its repercussions. As Council members, we have an obligation to ensure moderation and restraint. International conflict laws must take precedence over these actions, and all actors must halt violence and military operations. An immediate ceasefire is our best hope, as it would allow humanitarian access under United Nations Security Council Resolution 2712 and 2720. And most importantly, it would potentially enable negotiation towards peace. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, and I quote, "Resolving forced displacement is not only a moral or humanitarian imperative, but also deals with issues at the heart of the Security Council's mandate to maintain international peace and security." End of quote. Finally, Mr. President, in order to resolve the Gaza crisis, Mozambique call upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and return to dialogue before the situation deteriorates irreparably. In this vein, Mozambique continues to hold the view of a two-state Palestine and Israel coexisting peacefully in accordance with the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly relevant resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for that statement and now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie pour la convocation de cette séance et Monsieur Martin Griffiths et Madame Ilham Aliyev pour leur présentation. Leur analyse de la situation est sans équivoque. Les armes doivent se taire si nous souhaitons barrer la propagation du conflit et les souffrances de la population civile, faciliter l'accès humanitaire et la libération des otages. C'est pourquoi la Suisse appelle à prendre toutes les mesures visant à permettre immédiatement un accès humanitaire sûr, sans entrave élargie, et à mettre en place un cessez-le-feu humanitaire durable. Les actes de terreur injustifiables commis par le Hamas le 7 octobre dernier, le nombre de victimes, presque 1200, les violences, notamment sexuelles, subies par de nombreuses jeunes femmes et filles, ainsi que la prise d'otages, ont été profondément choquants. Nous les avons condamnés fermement et sans équivoque. Nous réitérons également notre appel à la libération immédiate inconditionnelle de tous les otages encore détenus à Gaza. Nous continuons d'attacher une grande importance au droit de chaque État d'assurer sa sécurité et au devoir de protéger sa population et celle sous son contrôle. Depuis ce jour-là, nous observons une augmentation alarmante du niveau de violence et de souffrance au Proche-Orient. À Gaza, plus de 23 300 personnes ont été tuées et plus de 59 400 blessés selon Bucha. 3 mois plus tard, aucune issue n'est encore visible. Il est de notre responsabilité, en tant que membre de ce Conseil en charge d'assurer la paix et la sécurité internationale, d'inverser cette tendance. Car la poursuite de cette violence menace non seulement de déstabiliser la région tout entière, mais met aussi en péril les fondements mêmes du système international basé sur le droit et les principes fondamentaux de l'humanité. En 3 mois, la bande de Gaza est devenue inhabitable et, comme le dit le secrétaire général, nul n'y est en sécurité. Au moment où nous parlons, 85% de la population à Gaza, dont de nombreuses familles avec enfants, a été contrainte de fuir. 1,4 million d'individus sont aujourd'hui entassés dans 155 structures surpeuplées et inadéquatement équipées de l'UNRWA. Aussi, la Suisse rejette et condamne toutes les déclarations visant à expulser les civils hors du territoire palestinien occupé, y compris de Gaza. La Suisse rappelle que les conventions de Genève interdisent le transfert forcé des populations qui peut constituer des crimes de guerre. Nous appelons les dirigeants de toutes les parties à s'abstenir de toute mesure unilatérale et de tout acte de provocation ou propos inflammatoires, notamment ceux qui vont constituer une violation du droit international. Il est urgent de négocier un tournant décisif pour sortir de cette crise qui menace la paix et la sécurité des Israéliens, des Palestiniens, de la région tout entière et bien au-delà. À cette fin, la mise en œuvre intégrale des résolutions 27-22 de ce Conseil est essentielle. Il est urgent d'augmenter l'aide humanitaire qui entre à Gaza, en garantissant un accès de l'aide rapide, sûr et sans entrave, conformément au droit international humanitaire. Car le statu quo est intenable pour les civils. Ils sont en proie à des graves menaces dues à la poursuite des intenses hostilités, à la pénurie de tous les biens et services essentiels à leur survie, causant la famine qui affecte déjà 1 demi-million de Gazaouis. À cet égard, la Suisse rappelle que l'utilisation de la famine comme méthode de guerre est strictement interdite par le droit international humanitaire et peut constituer un crime de guerre. En outre, des enquêtes doivent être menées sur toutes les violations du droit international commises en Israël et dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé, et leurs auteurs traduits en justice auprès des instances pertinentes. À cet effet, la Cour pénale internationale mène actuellement une enquête sur la situation dans le territoire palestinien occupé, qui couvre tant les faits relevant du 7 octobre que les événements en cours à Gaza et en Cisjordanie. Monsieur le Président, la recherche d'une solution politique à 2 États prônée par ce Conseil depuis des années est impérative. Les conditions doivent être préparées pour reconstruire Gaza en tant que partie intégrante d'un futur État palestinien vivant côte à côte avec Israël, en paix, à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant de sa déclaration. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la France. Je remercie M. Griffiths et Mme Brandskiris pour leurs exposés.
For their
Comme l'a dit le président de la République,
Emmanuel
il faut
Macron,
œuvrer
we must strive
immédiatement en faveur
immediately
d'un
to bring
cessez-le-feu
about
durable
a lasting
avec
ceasefire
l'aide de
with
tous
the
les partenaires
assistance of
régionaux et
all
internationaux.
regional and international
C'est
partners.
indispensable pour permettre d'acheminer davantage d'aide
Vital
aux
to do that,
populations
to
civiles de
facilitate the
Gaza.
delivery of more
Il faut
humanitarian
lever
aid to
les
the civilians in
obstacles pour
Gaza. We must
garantir
remove
l'accès humanitaire
obstacles
et
to
mettre pleinement en œuvre
guaranteeing
les
humanitarian
résolutions
access
2712 et
and to
2720.
allow the full
La
implementation of
France
resolutions
continuera à apporter une aide
2712 and
financière et
2720.
matérielle à
France will
destination de
continue
la
to provide
population de
humanitarian,
Gaza.
financial and material aid
Elle
to
salue
benefit the
l'engagement
civilian
de
population in the
l'UNRWA et
Gaza
de
Strip.
l'ensemble des
We
acteurs
welcome the
humanitaires.
work of UNRWA and of
La
all
France appelle à la
humanitarian
libération
personnel.
immédiate et sans
France calls
condition
for
de
the
tous les
immediate and
otages.
unconditional
Ce
release of all
Conseil doit
hostages. This council
condamner
must
les
condemn
attaques commises
the
par le
attacks
Hamas et
perpetrated
d'autres
by
groupes
Hamas and
terroristes
other
le 7
terrorist
octobre
groups on
dernier,
the 7th of
y compris
October,
les violences sexuelles.
including
La France
sexual
poursuivra son
violence. France
action
will continue
pour
its
établir
work
des
to
sanctions
impose
contre le
sanctions
Hamas
against
au niveau
Hamas
européen.
at a European level.
Sur le plan politique,
On a
la France
political level,
continuera de
France will
plaider pour la
continue
solution des
to
deux
call
États,
for the
ayant
two-state
l'un et
solution
l'autre
with
Jérusalem
both
comme
states
capitale,
having
la seule
Jerusalem
qui
as
puisse
their
permettre de
capital. That is
construire
the
une
only
paix juste et
solution which will
durable.
make it possible to
Le
bring
président de
about
la
a just
République
and
poursuit
lasting
ses
peace.
échanges
The
avec les
President of the
acteurs de la
Republic is
région pour y
continuing his
parvenir. Il faut
discussions with the
travailler
stakeholders in the
à
region to achieve that
l'édification
goal. We must
d'un
work
État
to
pour les
build a
Palestiniens.
state for the Palestinian
L'autorité
people. The
palestinienne
Palestinian
a un
Authority
rôle
has
central
a
à jouer dans ce
pivotal role to play
processus
in that
en
process
Cisjordanie
in the West Bank
comme à Gaza,
and in
qui a
Gaza,
vocation
which
à
is
faire
destined
partie de
to
cet État
become part of
palestinien.
that Palestinian
Ce
state.
Conseil a rappelé
This
dans sa
council
résolution
recalled in
2712
its
que le
resolution
déplacement forcé de
2712 that the
populations
forced
civiles était
displacement of
contraire
civilians was
au droit
counter
international.
to
La
international
France
law.
condamne par ailleurs la
Moreover,
politique de
France condemns
colonisation
the policy
qui
of
est
settlement
illégale
that is
et qui
illegal
constitue un obstacle majeur à la
and
solution des
is
deux
a
États.
major impediment
Il
to
est
the
essentiel de
two-state
mettre fin aux
solution. It is
violences des
vital to
colons
put an
en
end to
Cisjordanie.
settler violence in the
Enfin,
West Bank.
il est
Finally,
urgent
it is of the
d'éviter un
utmost
embrasement
importance to
régional. La
avoid a
stabilité du
regional
Liban et de la
conflagration.
région
Ensuring stability
nécessite
in
le
Lebanon
plein
and the
respect de
region
la résolution
requires absolute
1701
adherence to
par toutes les
Resolution
parties. La France
1701 by
condamne
all
fermement
parties.
les
France
attaques
staunchly
Houthis
condemns the
contre les
Houthi
navires
attacks
commerciaux en mer Rouge
against commercial
qui
vessels in the Red
portent
Sea.
atteinte aux droits et
These
libertés de
undermine
navigation et
navigational rights and
continuera à assumer
freedoms.
ses
We will continue
responsabilités
to shoulder our
pour contribuer
responsibilities
à la
to
sécurité
contribute
maritime
to
dans la
maritime
région.
security in the
Je vous
region.
remercie.
I thank you.
Je reprends mes
I
fonctions
now
de
resume my
président du
function as
Conseil et je
President
donne
of the
maintenant
Council,
la
and
parole à
I now give the
l'observateur
floor
permanent
to
de
the permanent
Palestine.
observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, أود بداية أن أعبر
At the outset,
عن
I
شكرنا
would like to
للشقيق
express
الجزائر
our thanks to
على
our
الدعوة لعقد
fraternal
هذا
country,
الاجتماع.
Algeria, for calling for this meeting.
Allow me to thank the briefers, USG Mr. Griffith and ASG Ms. Karras, for their statements, but more importantly, for the relentless efforts of the United Nations to uphold its mandate in circumstances made deliberately impossible. Allow me also, before delivering my statement, to make two remarks. First, we thank South Africa for its moral leadership with the case it presented before the ICJ yesterday against Israel for genocide. We advise those who were unable until now to even say that Israel has committed grave breaches of international law, let alone hold Israel accountable, to avoid claiming some legal or moral authority to criticize South Africa for seizing the highest judicial body of our international law-based order to address one of the most important situations of our time. The lesson of the Holocaust is not that you should defend Israel when it is committing atrocities, but rather that one should stand against atrocities regardless of who commit them and who endure them. Second, the best way to avoid regional escalation is not the threat or use of more fire, but action for an immediate ceasefire. I have to say, one would have hoped that saving Palestinian children's lives would be met with the same urgency to act and to provide protection granted to shipping lanes. Mr. President, it took 75 years for the United Nations to finally recognize the Nakba. Instead of seeing the Nakba end, our people are yet again confronted with large-scale massacres aimed at forcibly displacing them. This is a Nakba that the world is watching unfold before our eyes. I am from the generation born with the Nakba, with its massacres, its tents and its hardships. I never thought I would see it happen again in my lifetime. 70% of Palestinians in Gaza are already refugees who were denied their right of return for decades now. Many of the people in Gaza have had their homes destroyed in previous assaults. Palestinians in Gaza today mourn their loved ones and mourn their homes that they built and rebuilt for themselves and their families. They mourn their city. They mourn the Gaza Strip as all its landmarks have been destroyed. Every place people had happy memories, it has been disfigured. Now, every corner is filled with agony and death and suffering. In 100 days, virtually every Palestinian in Gaza has been displaced multiple times, from a home to a UN shelter to a tent, searching for safety everywhere, finding safety nowhere, searching for life anywhere, met by death everywhere. Israel has deliberately destroyed everything. It killed and maimed our children, our doctors, our journalists, our engineers, our poets, our academics. It destroyed the very requirement of life and of a life in Gaza. No homes to live in, no schools or universities to study, no hospitals to heal, no mosques or churches to worship, no agricultural land to farm, no bakeries for bread, no drinkable water, no markets to buy from, no safety, no future, and as Mr. Griffith said correctly, no safe place in the Gaza Strip. It was hoping Palestinians would leave under the pressure of its bombardments. They have not. Now it is hoping they will leave because of the destruction the bombs have left behind. Palestinians are traumatized by the Nakba. They have laid even deeper roots in the hope of preventing it from reoccurring. But it is unjust that their lives should be hell on earth just because they refuse to leave their homeland. Our people have a simple dream: to live in freedom and dignity on their land. This is their right, and yet they keep being stripped away from it for decades now. Mr. President, the Secretary General was unequivocal in his report and his statements, together with the entirety of the UN system. Saving civilian lives, allowing humanitarian access and aid, preventing famine, and stopping the spread of infectious diseases, and preventing regional escalation all require an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. You cannot do any of these things without immediate ceasefire. If you want to send humanitarian assistance up to scale, if you want to prevent the forced displacement, if you want an army of humanitarian officers from the United Nations to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance to every corner in the Gaza Strip, you cannot do it without a ceasefire. The SG is correct, Mr. Griffith is correct, and all those who believe in that are correct. And we thank you for the unanimous decision or position of rejecting forced displacement. We acknowledge that. We appreciate that. And we thank you also for the unanimous position of asking for humanitarian aid to be up to scale as the SG requested. And we thank you for that. What you are not unanimously agreeing to is the requirement to do it, the guarantee to do it, which is calling for a ceasefire and for a ceasefire now. And we hope that soon that you will become unanimous in that decision to call for a ceasefire. Instead, mass killings of Palestinians by Israel continue. Death is everywhere. Now it has new shapes, new names, as starvations, dehydration, disease are spreading like wildfire. This is not a consequence of a war, but an Israeli-made humanitarian catastrophe. Israeli confession or denials are irrelevant. Their actions speak louder enough, and action speaks louder than words. Israel wants the Palestinian people to choose between destruction and displacement, between genocide and ethnic cleansing. You need to act now to stop the genocide underway, to save lives, to put an end to this carnage and to restore life in Gaza. And our people will have to figure out how to live with such loss, pain, suffering, and trauma, with how to live without their loved ones, or without limbs, or with visible and invisible scars. Mr. President, there has always been two visions about how to end this conflict. Live and let live, uphold international law, end the occupation, fulfill Palestinian rights, and achieve just and lasting peace based on UN resolutions. That is the international consensus. And another vision, a supremacist, racist, criminal, and delusional vision that somehow this conflict could end by Palestinians accepting that they have only three options: death, exodus, or subjugation. This incessant attacks against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, to force them to leave also stem from that same logic, the one that denies Palestinian existence, Palestinian rights, and Palestinian statehood, the one that considers that the solution is not ending the Nakba, but taking it to its term. The international position is clear. There is not a people too many in our region. There is a missing independent state. Act accordingly. Protect the Palestinian people and support the independence of the Palestinian state. Mr. President, the Palestinian people are here to stay. We are as old as our Roman olive trees. They have a right to live in freedom and dignity in their ancestral land. This is the only path towards shared peace and security. All those who want to see shared peace and security should not spread fire. They must support an immediate ceasefire and support it right now. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie l'observateur permanent de Palestine de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant d'Israël.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished council members, this is the second Security Council meeting this week on the situation in Gaza, and the 21st meeting on the subject since October 7th. Over the same period, 3 General Assembly sessions were convened, 2 Security Council resolutions were adopted, as well as 2 General Assembly resolutions. Sadly, not a single one of these resolutions condemned Hamas for their heinous massacre of 1,300 Israelis and for taking 240 hostages. Nearly 100 days have passed. Nearly 100 days of 136 children, women, and elderly being held in dark Hamas terror tunnels. And still, not a single discussion here was dedicated to advance their release. Not even one. 100 days, for heaven's sake. 100 days, and not once has this council convened in order to focus on freeing the hostages. Little baby Kfir Bibas is about to mark his first birthday. A quarter of his life spent as a hostage in the hands of rapists and murderers. And the council has taken no action to secure his release. 100 days. And Hamas has not even permitted the Red Cross to visit the hostages. This is the most heinous war crime. And what has this council done? But colleagues, these are all symptoms of the same cancer that is rotting this institution. For years, the United Nations has been exploited by dictators and human rights abusers. And today, it has become another weapon in the arsenal of terrorists. The UN has lost all moral credibility. 98 days after the most widespread massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, it has become evidently clear that the United Nations can only unite on one thing: the demonization of Israel. 76 years ago, here at the UN, there was a moment of justice and morality when the General Assembly adopted the partition plan, establishing a Jewish state, establishing an Arab state. Israel, as you probably remember, immediately accepted the resolution and established a thriving state, democracy. The Palestinians, on the other hand, rejected the resolution, and from that moment on, for the past 76 years, they have used every means to annihilate us, including the use of the UN as a weapon. They called their failure to commit a genocide against the Jewish people the Nakba. You heard it today. Council members, there is not one single UN body that has remained untainted by politicized anti-Israel bias. Every UN body has become weaponized against Israel by the Palestinians and their automatic anti-Israel majority.
Just look at this meeting. The Arab League representative on the Council found it crucial to discuss the forced displacement of Gazans in the same week that Gaza was already discussed here in depth and in the General Assembly. First, let me be very clear. There is no forced displacement. As Israel's Prime Minister said 2 days ago, Israel has no intention of displacing the population in Gaza. Israel is solely fighting Hamas terrorists, whose core strategy is to use Gazan civilians as human shields and who have converted every inch of Gaza to a terror war machine. To ensure that October 7th never happens again, Israel must eliminate Hamas. You all know it. Yet, Hamas has embedded itself in and under civilian infrastructure. There is hardly one home in Gaza that weapons were not found. So, in order to mitigate civilian casualties, Israel requested the temporary evacuation of civilians from active war zones. After all, temporary evacuation is reversible, while the loss of life is not. You know the facts, yet, due to political interests, some of you prefer spreading falsehoods over the truth. Israel be damned. Colleagues, as we speak, there are over 1 million Muslims being forcibly removed from their homes. All of their possessions taken from them as they face poverty, famine, and disease. No, I'm not talking about the situation in Gaza, but about Pakistan's forced displacement of 1.3 million Afghans. Afghan families that lived their entire lives in Pakistan are being forcefully expelled, their lives destroyed and their future lost. 85% of those fleeing are women and children, 85%. This council convened 21 times primarily to assist the people of Gaza at the account of Israel defending itself against Hamas terrorists, but not even once to focus solely on defending the rights of Afghans in Pakistan. Why does the forced displacement of Muslims from a Muslim country mean nothing to the Algerian representative and the Council? I'll tell you why. No Jews, no news. But this is merely one example. On Christmas, 200 Nigerian Christians were murdered by Muslims. Over the past decade, 50,000 Christians in Nigeria have been butchered and hacked to death. Is this even a concern to the Council? Again, no Jews, no news. Colleagues, this Council speaks a lot about proportionality. But where is the proportionality when it comes to your obsession against Israel? You dedicate hours talking about Israel and attempting to tie our hands when brutal dictatorships and murderous regimes such as Iran and others are hardly a focus here. Sadly, you are not the captains of this ship. The Council is being led by the poisonous political goals of the biased majority in the UN. Every UN body is now a weapon against Israel, and as a result, those in real need remain helpless. By focusing mainly on Israel, a country that represents 0.1% of the global population, every human rights abuser can continue their crimes unimpeded. Colleagues, in 2023, the General Assembly passed more resolutions against Israel than against Iran, North Korea, and Syria combined. Iran, a country that murders women for not properly wearing their head coverings, guns down peaceful protesters, thousands, and hangs members of the LGBTQ community from cranes while funding terror across the globe, had only one GA resolution passed against it, while its leaders are given the red carpet treatment here at the UN. Syria, a country that has murdered Hundreds of thousands of its own citizens with barrel bombs and chemical weapons also had only one resolution passed against it. Israel had over a dozen, just like every year. It should be crystal clear to every person in this room that the UN is not only broken, it is dangerous. It took UN women 60 days to release a loose and vague statement on Hamas's sexual violence despite the overwhelming evidence of their crimes. To the UN, Israeli women are not women. Under-Secretary General Griffith libelously said recently that Gaza is the worst humanitarian crisis, the worst he has ever seen. Really? He saw the killing field of Khmer Rouge. He saw 400,000 Yemenis murdered and starved to death. But to him, Gaza is worse. Every single day, Israel facilitates truckloads of food, water, and medical supplies to Gaza and supports every humanitarian initiative, while OCHA refuses to even report about Israeli victims of terror. Where are his concerns? By the way, where are your concerns of Palestinian leaders, Palestinian officials' incitement to terrorism? They pay the terrorists. They don't only talk about it, they pay them to kill Jews. The PA did not even condemn the October 7th massacre. Where are the concerns? Even the WHO has joined the Palestinians' arsenal. In May, at the WHO annual meeting, a special debate was held to single out Israel, the only country in the world singled out for condemnation with its very own special agenda item was the Jewish state. At that same annual meeting, North Korea was elected to the WHO board, upon which Syria and Yemen also sit. This is how distorted the UN has become. The same goes for UNRWA. Just this week, a Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza was exposed to contain many posts celebrating and praising Hamas's massacre. The rapist murderers were praised as heroes. Their education was glorified, and pictures of dead and captured Israelis were gleefully shared. Countless weapons caches and rockets have been found in UNRWA schools across Gaza, as well as sickening education materials promoting martyrdom and anti-Semitism. This is a UN agency manufacturing generations of hate and violence. It is literally a UN-facilitated weapon against Israel. The list of different UN agencies and bodies that have been weaponized against Israel is endless. But of all the anti-Israel organs at the UN, there is one that puts all others to shame, and this is the Human Rights Council. Currently, important to know the facts, out of the Council's 47 members, only 17 actually uphold human rights in their own countries. And this is the Council we trust to be a lighthouse of morality and good. Not a single Human Rights Council resolution has been focused on the police state of Cuba, not even once, or the authoritarian regime of Venezuela. No Jews, no news. Iran even recently chaired a human rights social forum. To the UN, darkness is light and wrong is right. Israel is the only country that is bashed at every Human Rights Council session due to Special Agenda Item 7, bash the Jews and make news. Like in the General Assembly, Israel has more resolutions passed against it at the Human Rights Council than any other country by a long shot. 1/3 of all commissions of inquiry ever established by the Council have been, guess against who, have been to investigate Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. You're invited to visit, even though you don't want to. Colleagues, just when Israel thought that the UN had hit rock bottom, this organization proved us wrong. South Africa's libelous case at the ICJ is the epitome of the UN's dystopian reality. How can it be that the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, adopted following the genocide of the Jewish people, is now being weaponized against the Jewish state while serving the Hamas terrorists that perpetrated the massacre? Anyone who looks at the facts on the ground can see that South Africa's case is baseless. Hamas is the one that declares publicly and seeks to commit genocide against Israelis, not the other way around. The body that should truly be sitting on trial is the UN. The UN is an accomplice of terrorists. The UN has turned a blind eye to Hamas's digging of terror tunnels for 18 years under schools and Hamas's exploitation of international aid to fund their terror war machine. Mr. President, Israel is fighting the most just war. Israel was attacked unprovoked by Hamas ISIS terrorists whose stated goal is to annihilate us. It is written in their charter, and they have sworn to publicly to repeat the atrocities of October 7th until they achieve this goal. No country, dear colleagues, in the world would accept a ceasefire in a similar situation until such a threat can no longer be actualized. You all know this. So why are you still being steered by politics? Why are you directly following the script of terrorists? Do you not bother to think what will happen if in Israel and Gaza, if there is a ceasefire? We know what will happen. Hamas will continue its reign of terror in Gaza. How can you speak about the two-state solution or any other solution together with a ceasefire that will keep Hamas in power? What kind of future do you think the region will have if this happens? Hamas knows that it cannot defeat Israel on the conventional battlefield. So instead, it uses terror to attempt to drive us away out of fear while weaponizing the UN to help it achieve its goal. The time has come to take back the UN, to force this institution to live up to its founding principles. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël de sa déclaration. Le représentant de l'Algérie a demandé la parole pour faire une autre déclaration.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de me donner la parole pour la seconde fois. Rassurez-vous, je vais être bref.
Rest assured, I will speak
Je
only
vais
briefly,
essayer de
but
vous
I
aider
am going to attempt
à
to
conclure
help you
cette
to
session de notre
conclude
Conseil
this meeting of our
sur une note
council
positive.
on a positive note.
D'abord,
First of all,
je voudrais
I
remercier
wish to thank
tous mes collègues
all my colleagues
au Conseil de sécurité
at the Security
pour
Council
leur contribution
for
substantielle
their substantive
sur le sujet
contributions
qui nous
to
réunit aujourd'hui,
the
c'est-à-dire
matter which convenes us
le
here
projet
today.
de déplacement
That
forcé
is the project of
de
forcible
la population
displacement
palestinienne.
of the Palestinian
Au
population.
terme de nos échanges de cet après-midi,
In light of our discussions this
on peut
afternoon,
conclure
we can conclude
qu'il y a un
that there
consensus
is
au
consensus
sein du Conseil de
within
sécurité
the Security Council
autour du rejet catégorique
behind the
de
need
tout
to
projet
categorically reject
visant
any
directement
project aiming
ou indirectement
directly or
le déplacement
indirectly
forcé
to
des
bring about
Palestiniens
the forced
de
displacement
leurs
of the
terres.
Palestinian people from their
C'est un
lands.
consensus
This
rare,
is a rare
c'est un
consensus.
consensus
It is
précieux
a invaluable
réconcilie
consensus
avec
which
le
brings us
multilatéralisme.
together and reconciles us
Ne
with
pourrions-nous pas
multilateralism.
avancer ensemble
We cannot forge ahead
sur la base de ce consensus
together
retrouvé,
on the
au
basis
sein
of this
du Conseil,
consensus within
même s'il
this
ne
council?
concerne qu'une partie de la question palestinienne?
But we must do that
Cela
even
aurait, j'en suis certain,
if it only deals with one part of the Palestinian issue,
extraordinaire
because if we do work
au
together on the
sein
basis
de
of that
l'opinion
consensus, that will
publique
reverberate
dans
in
le
an
monde
extraordinary fashion
et surtout
in terms of public opinion
dans
throughout
notre
the
région.
world, and particularly
Dans notre
within our
région,
region. So we need to
où, je
work
dois
together
l'avouer,
on the basis of that consensus.
les Nations Unies
I must confess that
et
in
le
our
Conseil
region,
de
the United
sécurité
Nations and the Security
ont
Council
besoin de
need
reconquérir leur crédibilité
restore their credibility
la confiance
and
dans leur action.
rebuild trust
La
in
délégation
their
algérienne
endeavors. The Algerian
est disposée
delegation
à
is
travailler
ready and willing
avec tous les
to
collègues
work with all
au sein
colleagues
du Conseil de
within
sécurité
the Security
pour
Council
avancer dans ce sens,
to make progress in
pour la
that
paix
direction,
dans notre
for
région,
peace
mais
in our
aussi dans le
region,
monde.
but
Je
also
vous
throughout
remercie.
the world. I thank you.
Je remercie
I
le
thank
représentant de
the
l'Algérie de
representative
sa
of Algeria
déclaration.
for that
Il n'y a plus
statement. There
d'oratrices
are
ou
no
d'orateurs
additional
inscrits sur la
speakers
liste.
on our
La
speakers
séance
list.
est levée.
The meeting is adjourned.
La
The 9,532nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security. The agenda is adopted.
Conformément
In
à
accordance
l'article
with
39
Rule
du règlement
39
intérieur
of the
provisoire du
Council's
Conseil,
provisional rules of procedure,
j'invite M.
I
Khaled
invite
Kiari,
Mr. Khaled Kiari,
sous-secrétaire général pour le
Assistant
Moyen-Orient,
Secretary General
l'Asie
for
et le
Middle East,
Pacifique au
Asia and the
département des affaires
Pacific in the
politiques
Department
et
of
de la
Political and Peace
consolidation de
Building
la paix,
Affairs
à participer
and peace
à la présente
operations to
séance.
participate in
Il en
this
est ainsi
meeting. It
décidé.
is so decided.
Le Conseil de
The
sécurité
Security Council
va maintenant
will now
aborder
begin
l'examen
its consideration
du point 2
of
de
agenda
l'ordre
item
du jour.
2 of the agenda.
Je donne à
I now
présent
give the
la
floor
parole
to
à Monsieur
Mr.
Khaled Kiari.
Kiari.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
On 11th January, the military forces of the United States and the United Kingdom, supported by 4 countries, reportedly conducted over 50 air strikes and missile strikes on targets across Yemen, including in Sana'a, Taiz, Hudaydah, Hajjah, Saada, Damar, and Ib. According to the Houthis, this resulted in 5 dead and 6 wounded fighters. The United Nations cannot independently verify these figures at this time. As of this afternoon, no UN staff or premises were reported as having been affected. Yesterday's strike followed the continued Houthi targeting of vessels in the Red Sea, including what was reported as the largest attack to date on 9 January, which involved a combination of drones and missiles that were intercepted by the United States and the United Kingdom naval forces. Subsequent to the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2722 on 10th of January, the Houthis reportedly launched another attack using an anti-ship ballistic missile on 11 January. The former attack was claimed by the Houthis to be a preliminary retaliation for the killing of Houthis fighters by US naval forces in an incident reported on 31st of December. Mr. President, we are witnessing a cycle of violence that risks grave political, security, economic, and humanitarian repercussions in Yemen and the region. Recent humanitarian improvements in the country are fragile and could easily be reversed if there are further incidents, while progress on reaching a political settlement to end the war in Yemen could also be undermined, leaving the people of Yemen facing the impact of continued conflict. These developments in the Red Sea and the risk of exacerbating regional tensions are alarming. The Houthis' attack following the adoption of Security Council resolution and yesterday's events further demonstrate that the region is on a dangerous escalatory trajectory which could potentially impact millions in Yemen, the region, and globally. In a statement issued today, the Secretary General called upon all parties involved not to escalate even more the situation in the interest of peace and stability in the Red Sea and the wider region. All concerned parties must do their utmost to avoid further escalation, reduce tensions, and exercise restraint. We also reaffirm the importance of ensuring the safety and security of maritime navigation in the region, as emphasized in the Resolution 2722 of this Council. In that regard, we also call for the immediate release of the Galaxy Leader, which was seized by the Houthis on 19 November, and the release of her crew. Monsieur le Président, we call on this Council to continue its efforts in actively engaging with all concerned parties to prevent further escalation from exacerbating regional tensions or undermining regional peace, security, or international trade. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Je remercie
I thank
M. Chiari
Mr.
pour
Chiari
son
for his
exposé
briefing.
et je donne
I
maintenant la parole aux
now
membres du
give the
Conseil
floor
qui souhaitent
to
faire
those
une
council
déclaration,
members who
à
wish
commencer
to make a
par le
statement. I
représentant de
begin
la
by giving the
Fédération
floor
de
to the
Russie.
representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
President,
Халиду Керри за его
we thank
доклад о
Mr.
ситуации.
Kiris for the
Вообще-то в
briefing on the
условиях очевидной
situation
вооруженной
in
агрессии
general,
по отношению
given
к
the
суверенной стране,
blatant
в
armed
качестве докладчика мы бы
aggression
сегодня хотели видеть генерального секретаря
against
ООН.
against another country.
Мы хотели увидеть
we would like to see as a briefer the UN Secretary General in this situation. The main task of the United Nations enshrined in its charter is to prevent threats to peace and to suppress acts of aggression or other violations of peace in accordance with the principles of international law. With great regret, we note that yesterday we encountered just such a situation, armed aggression by a group of countries against another state. The 11th of January, the so-called international coalition headed by the US and Great Britain, comprising Australia, Canada, Bahrain, and as they call themselves, vaunt themselves as the capital of global justice, the Netherlands. These states all carried out a mass strike on Yemeni territory. I'm not talking about an attack on some group within the country, but an attack on the people of the country on the whole. Aircraft were used, warships and submarines. There are reports that U.S. Navy craft launched Tomahawk missiles as well. These strikes hit the Yemeni port of Hodeidah, the cities of Sana, Sada, Zabid, Taiz, and Damar. Americans and their satellites bombarded airports and other infrastructure. At the site of the craters, explosions gave rise to fires. What we're seeing in Yemen, unfortunately, is painfully familiar. The same picture of destruction for 3 months has already been unfolding in the Gaza Strip. Right now, the long-suffering Yemen is becoming a hotbed of hostilities in the region once more. The war is spreading to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Yet Washington is clearly not going to leave it at that. The White House has announced that they reserve the right to resume hostilities if they see new threats. You don't need to have clairvoyance to understand that these threats and these measures to respond from them will be determined arbitrarily by the U.S. without the slightest regard for international law. President, despite the assertions of our Western colleagues, these massive strikes by the U.S. and Great Britain on the territory of Yemen have nothing in common with the exercise of the right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Article 51 doesn't apply to the situation with commercial shipping. The right to self-defense cannot be exercised in order to ensure the freedom of shipping. Our American colleagues know this fact very well. Yet no sanction by the UN Security Council under our Article 7 of the Charter was forthcoming either. Colleagues, the situation is crystal clear. The actions of the so-called coalition utterly blatantly violate Article 2 of the UN Charter. The latest military aggression of the collective West is part of a long track record of attacks on the long-suffering Middle East. All of these pseudo-legal justifications of the White House don't stand up to any criticism. I want to recall once more that the freedom of navigation is governed by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. In the event of a violation of the convention provides for starting negotiations with the violator and to submit a suit for arbitration or to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. Nothing in this document or in the norms of international law in conventional law gives anyone the right to attack a sovereign country. It's also clear that Washington is trying to provide at least a shred of justification for its illegitimate actions, and it can't even get its story straight. What's absolutely risible is the fact that the U.S. mentioned the concept of piracy. It's clear to anyone that's risible that has taken even the slightest glance at the definition of piracy in Article 101 of UNCLOS. But even if we're talking about pirates, the convention gives you the right to seize a pirate vessel and prosecute the crew and not to bomb yet another country into the Stone Age. President, Russia time and again has warned about the risks of such a scenario. We have been consistent in our calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. This includes with the aim of preventing a further regional escalation and to prevent neighboring countries being drawn into it, even indirectly being drawn into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict amid the unprecedentedly brutal Israeli military operation in Gaza. But all attempts of the UN Security Council to take a decision to stop the violence were obstructed by the United States. Time and again, instead of addressing the root causes of instability, they've favored political solutions to the problem. Instead of favoring political solutions, the West has chosen force. Instead of compelling Israel to stop hostilities in Gaza, they've been given the opportunity to continue wiping out Palestinian women and children. During the voting on the American-Japan draft resolution on the so-called freedom of shipping in the Red Sea, we cautioned against taking the Western delegations at their word with regard to their supposedly noble intentions. From the very beginning, they intended to give a twisted explanation with vague wording in order to provide at least some shred of legitimacy for their criminal acts. In anticipating the risks of this scenario, we proposed balanced amendments to the text that would have allowed for avoiding these risks. Unfortunately, the majority of council members were not decisive enough to support our amendments. Nonetheless, even in its current form, in Resolution 2722, there's no reference to Article 7 of the Charter, and there's no authorization for the arbitrary acts that the U.S. and its satellites are carrying out in Yemen. This resolution is fraught with the risk of a full-fledged war, not only in the country, but throughout the region. The President of the United States and its allies have a long track record of gross violations and tortured explanations of international law. They're trying to cover up their aggression against Syria with a fig leaf. In so doing, the U.S. concocted an absurd concept which supposedly allows for collective self-defense with a non-state actor, that is the Syrian Kurds, against the Syrian army on Syrian territory. It's clear that this concept had nothing in common with international law or with the UN Charter. The actions of the U.S. against Syria from the standpoint of international law are and remain a use of force which violates the UN Charter, that is military aggression and occupation. There was also a gross perversion of the provisions of Council resolutions to the extent that the NATO coalition destroyed the Libyan statehood in 2011. Recently, the French cynically called the right to self-defense the latest war crimes of the Kiev junta. That was an attack with cluster bombs on a children's facility in Belgorod. There were no military attacks there, and these cluster munitions were used to increase the number of civilian victims, including women and children. The massacres that Israel is continuing in Gaza, the U.S. is continuing to call that self-defense, although the International Court of the UN, in its advisory opinion in 2004, directly said that Israel could not cite Article 51 as regards to its actions in the occupied Palestinian territories, considering the particularities of the statuses of those territories. Apparently, Washington isn't interested in international law or the International Court of the UN, neither are their allies. All Western countries are merely trying to further what they call the rules-based order. President, the Middle East is encountering a critical situation. I'm not even talking about the West violating the many years of attempts to settle the Yemeni conflict. The problem is much broader. These short-sighted steps undermine the security situation, and they undermine the attempts to normalize general regional stability. If the escalation continues, the entire Middle East could encounter a catastrophe. And everything that's happened up until now would seem to be no big deal compared to that. There could be countless lives lost. The responsibility for this should be borne by the U.S. and their henchmen, whose geopolitical interests have blocked a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and the same parties have become aggressors recently. We call upon the international community to decisively condemn this attack against Yemen carried out by the U.S. without a mandate of the UN, and we also agree with the concerns of our regional partners voiced to this effect, and we call for international efforts to stop the escalation of violence in the Middle East. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President, and I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. The United Kingdom and this Council has consistently condemned in the strongest terms the illegal and unjustified attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthi militants. On the 9th of January, the Houthis attacked UK and US naval vessels. Last night, we took limited, necessary, and proportionate action in self-defense alongside the United States with the non-operational support of the Netherlands, Canada, Bahrain, and Australia. The United Kingdom's Royal Air Force carried out targeted strikes against military facilities used by Houthi rebels in Yemen. This operation took particular care to minimize risks to civilians. Since November, the Houthis have launched over 100 drone and missile attacks against vessels from a range of countries, putting innocent lives at risk, threatening the global economy, and destabilizing the region. This has continued despite this Council's demand in Resolution 2722, adopted earlier this week, that the Houthis immediately cease all such attacks. Let me be clear. The attacks by Houthis on vessels in the Red Sea must stop. We have made this clear to the Houthis, and we call on them to de-escalate. The United Kingdom is committed to continue working with the international community and this Council to combat this international threat. We have published a summary of our legal position on last night's strikes and have reported to the Council in writing in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. President, we remain committed to ensuring freedom of navigation, which is protected by international law, and to defend international trade. It is in all our interests to work together to de-escalate tensions in the region. Thank you, President.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante des États-Unis.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Chiari, for your briefing. Colleagues, as you heard last night, in response to ongoing and escalating Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the United States and United Kingdom, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, conducted a number of joint strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. The aim of these strikes was to disrupt and degrade the Houthis' ability to continue their reckless attacks against vessels and commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. These strikes were necessary and they were proportionate, as you just heard from my UK colleague. They were consistent with international law and an exercise of the United States' inherent right to self-defense, as reflected by Article 51 of the UN Charter. And they were taken only after non-military options proved inadequate to address the threat. Still, any strike of this nature is a decision the United States does not take lightly. And so I'd like to walk us through how we reached this moment and discuss the steps that we all must take going forward to de-escalate this situation while upholding navigational rights and freedoms. Because while this coordinated response follows the Houthis' largest, most complex and most recent attacks earlier this week, the fact is that the Houthis' opportunistic attacks on vessels have been escalating since November. And colleagues, no one in this room is immune from the effects of these attacks, not even Russia, no one. Whether your ship flies an American flag or the flag of another nation, whether you voted for this week's resolution or you abstained from it, so long as any one of our ships are vulnerable, all of our ships are vulnerable. Since November 2000 ships have been forced to divert thousands of miles to avoid the Red Sea. More than 50 nations have been affected in 27 Houthi attacks on international commercial shipping. And Houthi militants have threatened or taken hostage mariners from more than 20 countries. That includes the crew of the Galaxy Leader, a Bahamas-flagged Japanese-operated vessel. On November 19th, Houthi forces hijacked the ship and kidnapped a multinational crew, including Bulgarian, Mexican, Romanian, Ukrainian, and Filipino citizens. Despite council calls for the release of the ship and its crew, the Houthis still hold them hostage to this day. Not long after, following the council's condemnation of these attacks, a Norwegian-flagged vessel was struck by what appeared to be an anti-ship missile launched from a Houthi-controlled area of Yemen. Days later, Houthi forces attempted to board a Marshall Islands-flagged vessel, while a pair of missiles were once again launched from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. And so on December 18th, the United States established Operation Prosperity Guardian, a 22-country-strong defensive coalition to help defend against Houthi threats in the Red Sea. On December 19th, 1 month after the Houthis first took MV Galaxy Leader and its crew hostage, 44 countries condemned Houthi interference with navigational rights and freedoms in the Red Sea. Unfortunately, the Houthis continued their attacks. On December 26, the United States forces intercepted 12 one-way attack drones, 3 anti-ship cruise missiles, and 2 land attack cruise missiles in the southern Red Sea, all fired by the Houthis at multiple vessels crossing the waterway. Aiming to deter further attacks and de-escalate the situation, the United States put forward a presidential statement, one that received strong support, save unfortunately for one member of this council. As we deliberated further on December 30th and 31st, the attacks escalated when Houthis targeted and then attempted to commandeer a Singapore-flagged and Denmark-owned and operated ship. When Houthi attackers ignored warnings and fired on our naval helicopters, the United States responded by striking and sinking 3 of their 4 boats. And while the United States sought to defend commercial ships in the Red Sea, we also continued to pursue a diplomatic response. On January 3rd, the United States, along with 13 other countries representing some of the world's largest shippers, warned that the Houthis' attacks threaten innocent lives, the global economy, and the free flow of commerce, noting that the Houthis would bear the full consequences should they continue these attacks. That same day, this council convened an emergency meeting where there was a consensus for council action. And so in partnership with Japan, we penned a resolution that was adopted earlier this week following extensive consultations. This resolution once again called for the Houthis to cease these attacks and condemn those who provided the arms and assistance needed to carry them out. I'll also note that this resolution referenced the inherent right of member states in accordance with international law to defend their vessels from attacks. The inherent right. So why take you through this timeline? Because doing so makes this much exceedingly clear. Yesterday's strike was the latest in a series of actions in self-defense taken by the United States alongside other countries, and one that occurred against a broad diplomatic backdrop of global condemnation. Colleagues, the United States does not desire more conflict in a region already plagued by so much of it. Our aim is simple: to de-escalate tensions and restore stability in the Red Sea while upholding the fundamental principles of freedom of navigation. In order to do that, this Council must continue to do a few things. We must continue to make clear that despite bad faith claims to the contrary, most of the vessels the Houthis have attacked have nothing to do with Israel. And it goes without saying, attacks on any vessel in the Red Sea, regardless of our origin or ownership, are entirely unacceptable. Arguing otherwise risks legitimizing clear violations of international law. We need to also be clear about the role of Iran in these attacks. Without Iranian support, in violation of their obligations under Resolution 2216, the Houthis would struggle to effectively track and strike commercial vessels navigating shipping lanes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Every member of this Council, and especially those with direct channels to Iran, should press Iran's leaders to rein in the Houthis and stop these attacks. Finally, this Council itself must continue to demand that the Houthis cease their attacks and release the mariners and ship it continues to hold hostage. We must continue to uphold the free flow of commerce in one of the world's most critical waterways in accordance with international law. That was the charge before us when we first convened on this issue in December. It was the charge before us when we convened earlier this week, and that is the urgent charge before us today. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Slovénie.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I myself want to thank Assistant Secretary Kerry for his briefing this afternoon. I have three simple messages regarding the developments overnight. First, we condemn Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, which must immediately cease. This we made clear through the adoption of Resolution 2722 only 2 days ago. Freedom of navigation and maritime security are critically important for Slovenia. What is also clear is that any action to defend vessels from attacks must be undertaken in full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This means that principles of distinction, necessity, proportionality, and precaution should be upheld at all times. Second, the people of Yemen have suffered greatly through years of conflict, and they deserve sustainable peace. Since April 22, they have benefited from a truce which is broadly holding. It is regrettable that we have reached this point. Our sincere hope is that critical progress on UN-mediated peace talks can continue. And thirdly, it is in no one's interest to have a further dangerous escalation in the Middle East. We worry that these recent developments introduce a new dynamic to the region that has a potential to further complicate an already heated situation. We call for a de-escalation of tensions, and we urge restraint by the Houthis. We stand ready to engage on a comprehensive response to the crisis currently engulfing the region, a joint effort by a united Security Council is needed to avoid crashing into the abyss. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China would like to thank Russia for its call to hold this emergency meeting. We thank ASG Chiari for the briefing just presented. The US and UK launched airstrikes against targets in Yemen, further escalating the tense situation in the Red Sea region. China expresses its grave concern at this. The Red Sea is a critical route for the transportation of goods and energy for some time now. The Houthis carried out many attacks and seizures vis-à-vis commercial vessels in the Red Sea, which interrupts and disrupts international trade order and is detrimental to regional stability. China has called repeatedly on the Houthis to immediately cease their attacks and harassments on commercial vessels and respect the navigation rights of the commercial vessels of all countries in the Red Sea in accordance with international law. At the same time, China calls upon all parties, major countries with influence in particular, to play a constructive and responsible role and work together to maintain the safety and security of the shipping lanes in the Red Sea. It is regrettable to see that the blatant military actions taken by the relevant countries against Yemen have not only caused infrastructure destruction and civilian casualties, but have also resulted in heightened security risks in the Red Sea. This does not contribute to the protection of the safety and security of the commercial vessels and the freedom of navigation. The relevant military operations could also undermine the political process in Yemen. We fail to see how such military operations could achieve the stated objectives. It must be pointed out that the Security Council has never authorized any state to use force against Yemen. The military actions taken by the relevant countries are at odds with the Security Council Resolution 2722, which was recently adopted. China reiterates that no country shall misinterpret or abuse international law and Security Council resolutions and create new tensions in the Red Sea. The current tense situation in the Red Sea is one of the manifestations of the spillover effects of the conflict in Gaza. Allowing the conflict in Gaza to drag on while expecting it will not spread is wishful thinking and illusion. What's more, calling for the prevention of spillover of the conflict on the one hand, while adding fuel to the fire on the other by provoking military confrontation, is self-contradictory and irresponsible. The Middle East region is already on the brink of extreme danger. The last thing we need at this stage is reckless military adventurism. The first thing we need is calm and restraint to prevent further expansion of the conflict. We urge relevant parties, especially major countries with influence, to abide by the UN Charter and international law, keep to the right direction of dialogue and consultation, and make concrete efforts to maintain peace and stability in the Red Sea and in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de cette déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Équateur.
Gracias, señor presidente. Tomamos nota y agradecemos la información proporcionada por el subsecretario Chiari. Ecuador expresa su preocupación por la escalada del conflicto en estas últimas horas en el Mar Rojo y se une al llamado del secretario general a que todos los actores involucrados no agraven aún más la situación en el interés de la paz y la estabilidad de la región. Hace unos días en esta sala, mi delegación condenó los ataques terroristas perpetrados contra diversas embarcaciones comerciales en el Mar Rojo por parte de los houthíes, actos que constituyen una flagrante violación del derecho internacional y por lo tanto una amenaza a la paz y seguridad internacionales. Hoy el Ecuador
Ecuador
reitera
today
esa
reiterates
condena.
this condemnation.
Asimismo, Ecuador ha
In this regard,
expresado
Ecuador has
su
expressed its
preocupación
concern
sobre
regarding
el
the
riesgo
risk
de que esta
of
situación
this
exacerbe
situation
aún más las tensiones
exacerbating
en toda
tensions
la
still
región
further in the
y
whole
por
of
la
the region,
posibilidad de que esto
and the
pudiese
possibility that this
desestabilizar
might
aún más la paz y
destabilize still
seguridad
further
internacionales.
international peace and security.
La resolución
The resolution
adoptada por el
adopted
Consejo de
by the
Seguridad
Security Council
hace unos días
a few days ago
exige el
calls
cese al
for
fuego
a
de los
ceasefire
ataques houthíes a las embarcaciones
upon the Houthi
comerciales
attacks on
y
commercial
ordena
vessels,
liberar
and
al buque
calls for the
Galaxy
release
y su
of the
tripulación
Galaxy
de manera
and its crew
inmediata.
immediately.
Estas disposiciones son de
These
cumplimiento
provisions are
obligatorio
mandatory,
y deben utilizarse todos los
and
medios que
all
tiene este
measures at
Consejo
this Council's
para su
disposal must therefore be
implementación
used for
de
its
conformidad con el
implementation
derecho
pursuant to
internacional.
international law.
Los ataques a embarcaciones
Attacks
comerciales
upon
en el Mar
commercial
Rojo
vessels in the
afectan
Red Sea
directamente
directly affect
a la seguridad
the
alimentaria
food
y la crisis
insecurity and the
humanitaria en
humanitarian
Yemen,
crisis in Yemen,
además de tener impactos
as
a
well
escala
as
global
having
en las
impacts
cadenas
on a
de
global
suministro
scale on
regionales y
regional
en el
supply
aumento
chains
en los
and
precios de los
increases in the
bienes.
prices of goods.
Hacemos un llamado
We call
nuevamente
once again
para que el diálogo político
for
bajo los
political
auspicios
dialogue
de
under the
Naciones
auspices of the
Unidas
United Nations
sea el camino hacia la paz
as being
sostenible
the
en ese
path towards
país y
sustainable
que ninguna
peace in
acción
this
pueda
country.
borrar lo que
And
hasta
no
ahora se ha
action
podido
should be
lograr
taken to
para poner
reverse what has
fin
thus
a
far
este
been achieved
conflicto
in order to
que
bring an
tiene
end to
como
this conflict,
consecuencia
which is
la
resulting
peor
in the
crisis
worst
humanitaria
humanitarian
Gracias,
crisis in the
Presidente.
world. I thank you, President.
Je remercie le
I
représentant
thank
de
the representative
l'Équateur
of Ecuador
de sa déclaration
for their
et je donne
statement,
à
and I
présent
give
la
the floor
parole au
to the
représentant du
representative
Japon.
of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first express my appreciation to ASG Hiyari for his briefing. Since mid-November last year, the Houthi have been continuously attacking commercial vessels engaged in lawful maritime transit through the Red Sea. They have also illegally seized and are holding the Galaxy Leader, a vessel operated by a Japanese company, and its crews for more than 50 days. As everyone knows, these acts are flagrant violations of international law and a matter of serious concern for global maritime transportation. Such actions that jeopardize the freedom of navigation of commercial vessels and safety of crew members cannot be justified for any reason. The international community has repeatedly raised a strong voice in demanding for the immediate cessation of these attacks. This Council also issued a press statement last month and held an emergency meeting on January 3rd to express its grave concern against Houthi's irresponsible actions. On the same day, the countries concerned, including Japan, sent a clear message that the Houthis would bear the responsibility of the consequences if they continued to threaten lives, global economy, and the free flow of commerce in the region's critical waterways. The Houthis, however, have not stopped the attack against commercial vessels, have been escalating their illegal and unacceptable actions. Mr. President, only 2 days ago, Security Council adopted the Resolution 2722 demanding the Houthis to immediately cease their attacks against commercial vessels and reaffirming their navigational rights and freedoms in the Red Sea. To date, we have exerted all possible diplomatic efforts to resolve this issue. Regrettably, however, the Houthis have ignored the calls by the international community, including the unequivocal pronouncement by this Council. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom have conducted joint strikes against a number of targets in Houthis controlled areas yesterday to degrade the Houthis' capacity to make additional threat. Japan supports the determination of the United States and the United Kingdom and relevant countries to fulfill its responsibility in ensuring the free and safe navigation of vessels. To this end, we understand that these measures are aimed at preventing the further deterioration of the situation. Japan remains firm in its commitment to not tolerate any action that would disturb the inalienable freedom of safe navigation, and will take the necessary steps to seize the Houthis' threat while continuing to closely cooperating with relevant countries. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kyiv for his briefing to the Council. Mr. President, Mozambique is deeply concerned by the recent developments in Yemen, occurring less than a day after the Council adopted Resolution 2722. While we abstained from that vote, it is unfortunate that the Council's decision could be misinterpreted as sanctioning the use of force. As members of this Council, entrusted with maintaining international peace, we firmly oppose any action that undermine international security or could be misconstrued as sanctioning escalation. We are deeply worried by the potential involvement of other UN members in the escalation of the conflict and violence in the region. We believe that the employment of force at this precarious time undermines crucial ongoing diplomatic efforts to pull the region back from the brink amidst the ongoing Israel-Palestine crisis. We firmly believe that in the face of possible all-out conflict in the region, moderation and increased efforts to address the underlying cause of tensions in the region must take precedence. Mr. President, we categorically condemn any attacks that endangering commercial vessels and the safe and unhindered navigation in the Red Sea. Such actions are totally unacceptable. Mr. President, it is common knowledge that Yemen is currently facing a severe humanitarian crisis, and it is on the verge of becoming a new front in an already unstable region. This unfortunate situation in Yemen is fertile ground terrorists and extremists. We strongly advocate maximum caution and restraint by all actors in order to prevent the situation in the Red Sea worsening any further. Our mandate requires us to pursue peace rather than violence and ensure that every action we take safeguards the region from further escalation and hardship. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Mozambique pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de Malte.
Thank you, President, and thank you, ASG Kyiv, for your briefing. The Middle East continues to be in a state of turmoil. The conflict in Gaza, the deteriorating situation in the West Bank, hostilities along the Blue Line, and episodes of insecurity in Syria and Iraq paint a troubling picture. The rapidly deteriorating maritime security situation in the Red Sea is an equal cause of grave concern. The Houthi attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea are in violation of international law. They risk the safety of seafarers and other persons and jeopardize critical flows of goods. Respecting and upholding the navigational rights and freedoms of commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandab is of paramount importance. Attacks that threaten these rights are unacceptable and must be strongly condemned. We reiterate our call on the Houthis to immediately cease any attacks and actions against commercial shipping. President, ongoing violence in the region risks fueling an unfortunate situation where military escalation would be almost inevitable. It is fundamental to avoid any further escalation, and restraint must be exercised as outlined in Resolution 2722. We also stress that international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected at all times. A further deterioration in maritime security will have dire consequences for global trade. It will also have serious negative ramifications for the well-being of Yemen's civilian population, who heavily rely on imports for essential needs. This must be avoided at all costs. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Malte de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, nous remercions le sous-secrétaire général Khaled Chiari pour son intervention détaillant la succession des attaques des Houthis de ces derniers jours en mer Rouge ainsi que les frappes militaires d'une coalition américano-britannique de la nuit dernière. Ces développements sont très préoccupants et accroissent une nouvelle fois les risques d'une escalade régionale. En décembre, les membres du Conseil ont été unanimes dans un communiqué de presse pour condamner les attaques des Houthis contre les navires en mer Rouge et demander la libération de tous les membres d'équipage du Galaxy Leader. Il y a tout juste 2 jours, nous avons adopté la résolution 2722, réaffirmant l'importance du strict respect des droits et libertés de navigation en mer Rouge, conformément au droit international. Dans sa déclaration après le vote, la Suisse a partagé son appréciation juridique du 3e paragraphe opérationnel. Le droit mentionné dans cet article, c'est-à-dire le droit des membres des États membres, conformément au droit international, de défendre leurs navires contre les attaques, y compris celles qui portent atteinte aux droits et libertés de navigation, se limite stricto sensu aux mesures militaires destinées à intercepter des attaques contre les navires marchands et des navires de guerre pour protéger les dits navires et les personnes qui se trouvent à son bord. Dans ce contexte, toute opération militaire qui dépasse la nécessité immédiate de protéger les dits navires et les dites personnes serait disproportionnée et donc pas couverte par la résolution susmentionnée. La Suisse se montre préoccupée par les frappes militaires menées par la coalition américano-britannique. Les attaques et incidents en mer Rouge et dans la région ont des conséquences néfastes sur le trafic maritime et le commerce mondial, mais aussi sur la population civile au Yémen et dans la région. À un moment où les discussions de paix au Yémen connaissent des avancées importantes, nous devons contribuer à la préservation de ces acquis. De fait, à long terme, rien ne garantira mieux la sécurité de la mer Rouge qu'une paix durable au Yémen, incluant tous les acteurs concernés. Une nouvelle détérioration de la situation doit donc impérativement être évitée et nous avons collectivement les moyens de l'empêcher. La Suisse appelle en conséquence toutes les parties et les acteurs impliqués en mer Rouge et dans la région à la prudence et à la plus grande retenue, ainsi qu'au strict respect du droit international. Nous prenons note à cet égard de la déclaration commune de la coalition maritime, en particulier la volonté affichée d'une désescalade de la situation. En outre, le Conseil se doit d'être uni sur les questions de sécurité maritime et plus globalement dans ses décisions touchant de près ou de loin cette région et par extension le maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. Il nous incombe de prévenir et non d'exacerber les tensions montantes. La Suisse s'engagera pleinement dans ce sens. Je remercie
le représentant de la Suisse de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking ASG Chiari for his timely briefing. My delegation reiterates the vital importance of assuring free and safe navigation in the Red Sea, which is a pivotal global maritime route where about 15% of global sea trade passes. Any attacks against commercial vessels are unjustifiable and unacceptable under any circumstances. Despite a series of international calls urging the Houthis to cease their attacks on merchant and commercial vessels, such attacks in the Red Sea have continued, posing threats to lives and the free flow of commerce through this critical waterway. Resolution 2722, which this Council adopted only 2 days ago, clearly references the right of the Member States, in accordance with international law, to defend their vessels from attacks, including those that undermine navigational rights and freedoms. Any attempts to create fear by holding hostage the free flow of commerce in the Red Sea and to exploit the regional situation are destined to fail. Once again, we urge the Houthis to refrain from dangerous provocations and to immediately release the Galaxy Leader and its crew. At the same time, it is also imperative to prevent any further spillover from the precarious situation in the region for the protection of the civilians as well as for the global economy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée de sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this urgent meeting to receive an update from ASG Kyari on recent developments in Yemen, and we thank ASG for his briefing. We join other council members in expressing concern about the impact of recent attacks in the Red Sea and now in Yemen, on diplomatic efforts to achieve sustainable peace in Yemen, and on efforts to contain the ongoing conflict in the region. Last week, Council members gathered in this chamber and agreed on the need to avoid any further escalation in tensions. We also acknowledged the need to avoid jeopardizing the prospects of reaching a comprehensive peace agreement in Yemen, one that would finally end a 9-year war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. We listened to ASG Kyari caution about the risks of further compounding the already volatile situation in the region and expressed our support for the ongoing efforts of the Special Envoy. 1 week later, we seem to be faced with an entirely new dispensation, one where the prospects for progress and sustainable peace may be in jeopardy. Today, an estimated 18.2 million people in Yemen are still in need of humanitarian assistance. At the same time, international funding for humanitarian operations is on the decline. The Yemeni people can ill afford a re-escalation of hostilities. They deserve peace. The people of the Middle East deserve peace. Guyana calls for all sides to exercise restraint and to avoid taking any further actions that could derail ongoing efforts to find a sustainable, long-term solution to the crisis in Yemen. We therefore reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for an end to the attacks on commercial and merchant vessels in the Red Sea, and for the release of the Galaxy Leader vessel and crew. Finally, this Council must maintain its support for the Special Envoy's efforts to negotiate a sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Guyana de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank ASG Khalil Kyari for his important, informative briefing and insight. This Council on 10 January 2024 adopted Resolution 2722 to address the continued attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution in view of the principle to protect the navigational rights and freedoms by vessels of all member states and the threat posed to international peace and security, particularly in the region. In our explanation of position in the adoption of the Resolution 2722, we urge for due compliance and application of existing international law. In this regard, any action by member states that have taken place after the Security Council approved Resolution 2722 must be in line with the provisions of the resolution and existing international law. We condemn the attacks by the Houthis and urge compliance with the Council's resolution, and also call for the release of MV Galaxy Leader and its crew. Sierra Leone also reiterates the need for safeguarding the Yemeni peace process and the further need to address the root causes, including the conflict in the Gaza Strip. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Sierra Leone de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Algérie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, d'avoir convoqué cette réunion.
Thank you, President, for convening this meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Kyari, for your briefing. 2 days ago, during the adoption of the resolution on maritime security, Algeria stressed that military intervention cannot ease the tensions in the Red Sea region. Algeria expresses its deep concern regarding the ongoing military operation and airstrikes in the Red Sea region, targeting various sites and cities in Yemen. Algeria calls for restraint and caution at this critical juncture to avoid further escalation. Our opinion is that, first, the use of force will only complicate the situation in Yemen and may lead, unfortunately, to undermining the effort deployed by the Special Envoy of the Secretary General to end the war in Yemen and to relaunch the political process for a united Yemen with the government controlling his coastal borders and ensuring the security in the Red Sea. Second, addressing the root causes of conflicts in the region is now imperative. And in this context, the need for a ceasefire in Gaza has never been more urgent. Every day, we count more and more victims among civilian, women, and children. And only a ceasefire, an immediate and durable ceasefire, will ease the tensions in the region and avoid the spillover with catastrophic consequences in the whole region. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Algérie de sa déclaration. Je vais maintenant faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la France. Je remercie M. Chiari de sa présentation. La France condamne les attaques menées par les Houthis en mer Rouge contre les navires commerciaux. Elle se félicite de l'adoption de la résolution 2722 qui adresse un message de fermeté aux Houthis. Par leurs actions armées, les Houthis portent la responsabilité de l'escalade des tensions dans la région, ainsi que pour la stabilité internationale. Ils menacent directement 15% du commerce mondial. La France continue d'appeler à la libération immédiate du Galaxy Leader et de son équipage originaire des Philippines, de Bulgarie, d'Ukraine, de Roumanie et du Mexique, illégalement détenus par les Houthis. Nous demandons à la République islamique d'Iran, qui finance et arme les Houthis, de cesser ses actions déstabilisatrices. Par sa résolution 2722, le Conseil de sécurité a rappelé que l'exercice des droits et libertés de navigation doit être respecté et que les États ont, en accord avec le droit international, le droit de réagir à ces attaques. La France continuera à assumer ses responsabilités et à contribuer à la sûreté maritime dans cette zone en lien avec ses partenaires, comme elle a été appelée à le faire les 9 et 11 décembre dernier, lorsque la frégate Languedoc a été conduite à détruire des drones Houthis. Je vous remercie. Le représentant de la Fédération de Russie a demandé la parole pour faire une autre déclaration et je la lui donne.
Господин председатель, нас не удивляет откровенно слабые аргументы, которые сегодня пытались привести в оправдание своей агрессии Соединенные Штаты и Великобритания. Ведь иных аргументов попросту не существует, не может существовать. Нет никакой, подчеркну, никаких правовых оснований для их атаки на суверенный Йемен. О каком праве на самооборону Лондон и Вашингтон говорит за тысячу миль от собственных границ? С каких это пор это право стало распространяться на коммерческие суда? Тем более следующий, как это подтвердила сама постоянный представитель Соединенных Штатов под флагом третьих государств.
Очевидно одно, никакого легитимного мандата на силовые действия у самопровозглашенной коалиции нет.
Activities of this self-proclaimed coalition. There is no basis.
Одно дело защищать коммерческое судоходство, атаки на которые недопустимы. И совершенно иное, непропорционально и незаконно бомбить другое государство. Англосаксонский тандем со своими сателлитами очередной раз грубо нарушает уставную и другие нормы международного права, еще сильнее расшатывая ситуацию на и без того горящем Ближнем Востоке. Новые бомбежки и разрушения – вот это реальный вклад Запада в его эффективное ближневосточное дипломатию.
Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration. La représentante des États-Unis a demandé la parole à nouveau et je la lui donne.
We have been clear in our statement, despite the fact that my Russian colleague thinks it was weak. We carried out this action under Article 51. And this comes down simply to freedom of navigation, the free flow of commerce, and yes, for the United States, but also for more than 50 nations that have been affected by these attacks, whose ships have been rerouted thousands of miles to avoid violence. Crews have been held hostage, some to this day. Vessels have been fired on and frankly would have been hit without our intervention. And the situation in the Red Sea has become untenable for every single country that's been affected by these attacks. So de-escalation needs to happen. It needs to happen from the Houthis, who are putting all of our shipping lines in jeopardy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. I'll say briefly, as I said just now in my intervention, we've published a summary of our legal position on last night's strikes, and we have reported to the Council in writing in accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. I think that's comprehensive. Thank you, President.
Je remercie la représentante du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'oratrices ou d'orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée.
Steak on, that's it.